Jack Miller had been hunting these Oregon woods for 15 years, but something felt different that October morning. The Douglas firs stood too still, their massive trunks casting shadows that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. No birds called from the canopy above, and the usual rustle of small animals through the underbrush was absent. Even the wind had died to an unnatural stillness that made the hair on his forearms prickle beneath his hunting jacket. He adjusted the strap of his Remington 700 and checked his watch. 6:30 a.m. Prime time for elk to be moving through the timber between their bedding areas and the meadows where they fed. Jack had scouted this particular section of the Mount Hood National Forest for weeks, finding fresh sign along the creek that wound through the valley bottom. Rubs on the older trees, fresh droppings, and several deep tracks in the mud near the water's edge told him a good bull had been using this corridor regularly. The silence bothered him more than he wanted to admit. In his years of hunting, Jack had learned to read the forest's moods. When the woods went quiet like this, it usually meant a predator was nearby, a cougar maybe, or a black bear that had caught his scent and was watching him from cover. But this felt different, heavier somehow, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Jack worked his way along a faint game trail that paralleled the creek, stepping carefully to avoid breaking the silence with a snapped twig or the scrape of his boots against stone. The morning light filtered through the canopy in pale shafts, illuminating patches of moss and fern that carpeted the forest floor. His breath misted in the cold air, and he could feel the familiar weight of his hunting pack pressing against his shoulders. 20 minutes into his stalk, he found the first sign that something was wrong. A Douglas fir, easily 4 feet in diameter at the base, showed fresh scratches in its bark, about 8 feet off the ground. The gouges were deep, cutting through the thick outer bark to expose the lighter wood beneath. Jack had seen bear sign before, but nothing like this. The scratches were too high, too deep, and spaced too wide apart. He reached up to touch one of the marks, feeling the rough edges where something had torn into the tree with tremendous force. The scratches were still bleeding sap. Jack pulled out his phone to take a picture, but the screen remained black when he pressed the power button. He frowned and tried again, holding the button longer. Nothing. The battery had been at 60% when he checked it in his truck an hour ago. He shook the device and tried once more, but it was completely dead. A branch snapped somewhere behind him. Jack froze, every muscle in his body tensing as he slowly turned his head toward the sound. Through the trees, maybe 50 yards back along the trail he'd just traveled, something large moved between the trunks, just a glimpse of dark bulk shifting from one tree to another, there and gone before he could focus on it. Too big to be a deer, wrong shape for an elk, too dark for a bear. He waited, barely breathing, for several minutes. Nothing moved. No sound reached his ears except the distant whisper of water over stones in the creek. Jack told himself it had been a deer, spooked by his passage and circling back to investigate. Deer did that sometimes, curiosity overcoming caution. But his hands shook slightly as he adjusted his grip on his rifle. The game trail continued deeper into the forest, winding between massive stumps left by loggers decades earlier. New growth had sprouted around these monuments to trees that had stood here for centuries, creating a maze of saplings and brush that limited visibility to 30 yards in any direction. Jack found himself checking over his shoulder more frequently, that crawling sensation between his shoulder blades growing stronger with each step. When he found the second sign, his mouth went dry. In a patch of soft earth beside the creek, a footprint pressed deep into the mud. Jack knelt beside it, his heart hammering against his ribs. The print was enormous, easily 18 inches long and half again as wide as his size 11 boot. 5 distinct toe impressions showed in the front, with what looked like the ball and heel of a massive foot behind them. The depth of the impression suggested something incredibly heavy had made it. Heavier than any bear Jack had ever encountered. He looked around frantically for something to use as a size reference for a photo before remembering his phone was dead. Instead, he pulled a pen from his jacket pocket and laid it across the longest toe impression. The print dwarfed the writing instrument. Jack had seen plaster casts of alleged Bigfoot tracks in magazines and on television, always dismissing them as hoaxes or misidentified bear prints. But this was different. This was real, pressed into the earth in front of him, still fresh enough that water hadn't yet begun to fill the depression. The smell hit him then. It rolled down the valley like an invisible wave, thick and nauseating. The stench of something that had been dead too long, mixed with the musky odor of wet fur and something else, something organic and foul that made his gag reflex trigger. Jack pressed his sleeve against his nose and mouth, breathing through the fabric, but the smell seemed to penetrate everything. It was the smell of rot and wildness, of something that had never known soap or fire or any human comfort. A low rumble echoed through the trees, not a growl exactly, but something between a growl and a moan. So deep, Jack felt it in his chest as much as heard it. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating off the tree trunks and fading into silence. Jack's finger found the safety on his rifle, clicking it off as his eyes swept the forest around him. He should leave. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and head back to his truck as fast as his legs could carry him. But another part of him, the part that had made him a successful hunter, whispered that this was the chance of a lifetime. Nobody would believe him if he came back with just a story. He needed proof. He needed pictures. Jack remembered the small digital camera in his pack's side pocket. He'd brought it as backup in case his phone died, though he'd never expected the phone to actually fail. His hands shook as he dug through the pocket, finally closing around the familiar plastic rectangle. The camera's LCD screen flickered to life when he pressed the power button, showing a battery indicator at 3/4 full. He photographed the footprint from 3 different angles, making sure to include his pen for scale. The camera's flash seemed blindingly bright in the forest gloom, and he worried about whether the light might attract attention from whatever had made the track. But he needed the documentation. Without proof, this would just be another hunter's tall tale. The rumbling sound came again, closer this time. Jack looked up from the camera's LCD screen to find himself staring into a pair of eyes that reflected the camera's flash like mirrors. They were positioned about 8 feet off the ground, separated by a distance that suggested a skull much larger than any human's. For a frozen moment, predator and prey regarded each other across 30 yards of forest floor. Then the eyes blinked and disappeared. Jack's legs nearly buckled. He stumbled backward, nearly falling into the creek as his boots slipped on the muddy bank. The camera tumbled from his nerveless fingers, landing in the soft earth with a wet thud. By the time he scrambled to retrieve it and looked up again, the forest appeared empty. But the smell remained, stronger now, thick enough to taste. Movement caught his peripheral vision. Something large and dark shifted between 2 massive cedar trees to his left. Jack spun toward it, raising his rifle, but saw only shadows and bark. His breathing sounded incredibly loud in his own ears, harsh gasps that seemed to echo through the quiet woods. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill. The camera's LCD screen showed a spiderweb of cracks when he picked it up. The lens housing had twisted at an odd angle, and when he pressed the power button, nothing happened. His only means of documenting what was happening had been destroyed by his own clumsiness. Another branch snapped, this time to his right, then another behind him. Something was moving through the forest, keeping pace with him, staying just out of sight among the trees. Jack tried to track the sounds, swinging his rifle back and forth, but the noises seemed to come from everywhere. Whatever was out there was big enough to snap substantial branches underfoot, but it moved with surprising stealth for something of that size. Jack forced himself to think like a hunter instead of prey. If something was stalking him, his best bet was to make it to higher ground where he could see what was coming. The ridge to his north rose steeply through old-growth timber, offering rocky outcroppings that would give him both visibility and a defensible position. He began working his way upslope, trying to move quietly while still covering ground quickly. The sounds followed him. Every few steps, he heard another branch snap or the soft thud of something heavy moving through the underbrush. Once, he caught a glimpse of dark fur between two trees, there for just an instant before vanishing again. Whatever was tracking him seemed content to keep its distance for now, but Jack could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on him. His GPS unit, clipped to his belt, showed a blank screen when he tried to check his position. Like his phone, it had simply died without warning. Jack had been relying on the device to navigate these unfamiliar woods, and without it, he wasn't entirely certain which direction would lead him back to his truck. The forest all looked the same. Endless stands of Douglas fir and cedar, broken by occasional clearings, and the network of creeks that drained the mountain slopes. The slope grew steeper, forcing Jack to use his hands as well as his feet to navigate between the massive trees. His breathing became labored, but he didn't dare slow down. The sounds behind him continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. Whatever was following him had incredible patience and endurance. Sweat soaked through his hunting jacket despite the cool morning air. His heart hammered against his ribs with enough force that he worried it might burst. This was worse than the worst adrenaline rush he'd ever experienced while hunting. This was pure terror, the kind of primal fear that reached back to humanity's earliest memories of being hunted by things with bigger teeth and stronger hands. Jack reached a small clearing where windfall had opened a gap in the canopy. Weak sunlight filtered down through the opening, and he paused to catch his breath and get his bearings. The clearing was maybe 40 yards across, carpeted with ferns and dominated by the massive trunk of a fallen cedar that must have stood for centuries before disease or wind brought it down. He was checking his compass when the smell hit him again, so strong this time that it made his eyes water. Jack spun around, raising his rifle, and saw something that made his mind struggle to process what his eyes were telling him. It stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, motionless as carved stone. The creature was enormous, easily 8.5 feet tall, and massively built through the shoulders and chest. Dark brown fur covered its entire body, longer and shaggier around the shoulders and arms, shorter and finer across the torso. The head was proportioned like a gorilla's, but larger, with a pronounced sagittal crest running along the top of the skull. Small ears pressed flat against the sides of its head, but it was the eyes that held Jack frozen in place. They were intelligent, unmistakably aware, studying him with the same intensity that he was studying it. Not the blank stare of a wild animal, but the calculating gaze of something that was trying to decide what to do about the armed human who had invaded its territory. The creature took a step forward. Jack's finger found his rifle's trigger, but he couldn't bring himself to fire. The thing wasn't charging or making any threatening moves. It was simply walking toward him with the measured gait of something that had no fear of anything in these woods. Each step shook the ground slightly, driving home just how much the creature must weigh. At 20 yards, it stopped. The two beings regarded each other across the clearing, separated by a distance that the creature could cover in 3 or 4 strides if it chose to charge. Jack could see details now that made his hands shake. The fingers were incredibly long, easily twice the length of his own, ending in what looked like black claws rather than fingernails. The face was almost human in some ways, but the jaw was too massive, the brow ridge too pronounced. When it breathed, Jack could see the fog of its exhalation in the cool air. The creature tilted its head, studying him with obvious curiosity. Then it did something that nearly made Jack's knees buckle. It spoke, not words exactly, but a series of low vocalizations that rose and fell like speech. Grunts and huffs, and what sounded almost like questions, as if it were trying to communicate something. The sounds were deep, rumbling up from somewhere in that massive chest, but there was an unmistakable pattern to them, an intelligence behind the vocalizations that went beyond simple animal sounds. Jack tried to speak, to say something, anything, but his throat had closed up completely. His mouth worked silently as he struggled to force words past the terror that had seized his vocal cords. The creature watched his efforts with what might have been amusement, head tilted to one side like a dog trying to understand human speech. Then it stepped forward again. This time Jack's finger tightened on the trigger, but still he didn't fire. The creature wasn't behaving aggressively. If anything, it seemed almost gentle, moving with careful deliberation, as if it didn't want to frighten him. But the sheer size of the thing, the overwhelming physical presence, triggered every prey instinct Jack possessed. At 10 yards he could smell it clearly, the reek of unwashed fur and decaying meat, but also something earthier. The smell of moss and deep forest, of caves and places where sunlight never reached. It was the smell of wilderness in its purest form, untouched by human civilization. The creature extended one massive hand toward him, palm up, fingers spread wide. The gesture was unmistakably peaceful, an offer of contact that seemed almost human in its intent. Jack stared at the enormous hand, noting the thick black palm, the incredible length of the fingers, the way the wrist was twice as thick as his own. That was when his nerve finally broke. Jack stumbled backward, his boot catching on something hidden in the ferns. He fell hard, his rifle flying from his hands to land somewhere in the undergrowth. The creature immediately straightened, taking a quick step forward as if concerned by his fall. But to Jack, lying on his back and staring up at 8.5 feet of muscle and fur, the movement looked like the beginning of an attack. He rolled to his hands and knees, scrambling toward where his rifle had landed. His fingers closed around the weapon's stock, just as he heard the creature moving behind him. Jack spun onto his back, bringing the rifle around, and saw the massive form looming directly over him. The creature had moved with impossible speed and silence, covering the distance between them in the time it took Jack to retrieve his weapon. Now it stood above him, close enough that he could have reached out and touched the dark fur on its legs. This close, the smell was overwhelming, making his eyes stream and his stomach churn. But the creature made no move to attack. Instead, it simply looked down at him with those disturbingly intelligent eyes, head tilted as if trying to understand why he had fallen. When Jack raised his rifle, the creature took a step back, but its posture remained relaxed, almost casual. Jack's finger found the trigger. At this range, he couldn't miss. The .30-06 cartridge would punch through that massive torso like tissue paper, dropping even something that size. But as he stared into those eyes, he found himself unable to pull the trigger. The creature wasn't threatening him. If anything, it seemed curious, maybe even concerned about his welfare. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Jack on his back in the ferns, rifle raised and ready to fire. The creature standing above him, watching with patient interest. Neither moving, neither backing down. Then something snapped in the woods behind the creature, the sharp crack of a substantial branch breaking under weight. The creature's head swiveled toward the sound with lightning speed, and Jack heard it make a noise unlike anything he'd heard before. It was a growl, but deeper than any bear's, so low it was felt as much as heard. The sound held warning, territoriality, and unmistakable threat. The creature took 2 quick steps away from Jack, moving toward the source of the sound. As it moved, Jack got his first clear look at its profile. The massive shoulders, the way its arms hung down past its knees, the incredible length of its stride. It moved like a gorilla, but upright, with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Another branch snapped, closer this time. The creature called out, a series of deep vocalizations that echoed through the forest. Somewhere in the distance, another voice answered, different in pitch, but unmistakably similar in pattern. There was more than one of them, The realization hit Jack like cold water. He wasn't dealing with some solitary creature that had wandered down from the high country. This was their territory, and he was surrounded. The creature above him called out again, longer this time, more complex. The answer came from his left, then another from his right. At least 3 of them, maybe more, communicating in their deep, rumbling language. Jack couldn't understand the sounds, but the tone was clear enough. They were discussing what to do about the human who had wandered into their domain. Jack used the creature's distraction to roll away and climb to his feet, keeping his rifle trained on the massive form. The creature glanced back at him, but seemed more interested in the conversation it was having with its companions. The vocalizations continued, coming from different directions now as the unseen creatures moved through the forest. The thing standing in the clearing made a decision. It looked directly at Jack and made a series of sharp, grunting sounds, almost like it was giving him an order. When Jack didn't respond, it repeated the sounds more urgently, then pointed toward the downslope side of the clearing. Jack didn't need a translation. The creature was telling him to leave. He began backing toward the indicated direction, rifle still raised, watching the massive form for any sign of aggressive movement. The creature watched him go but made no move to follow. Instead, it called out again to its companions, and Jack heard the sounds of large bodies moving through the forest, keeping pace with his retreat but staying out of sight. The descent was treacherous. Jack tried to watch his footing while simultaneously keeping an eye on the forest around him, expecting at any moment to see another of the creatures step out from behind a tree. His legs shook from adrenaline and exhaustion, and several times he nearly lost his balance on the steep slope. The sounds followed him for what felt like miles, always just out of sight, but close enough that he could hear branches breaking and the soft thud of heavy footsteps on forest duff. They were escorting him out of their territory, making sure he continued moving in the right direction. Occasionally, one of them would call out and the others would answer, maintaining contact as they paralleled his route. Jack's truck seemed impossibly far away. Without his GPS, he had to navigate by compass and instinct, hoping he was heading toward the logging road where he'd parked. The forest all looked the same, endless stands of Douglas fir broken by occasional clearings and creek crossings. Every shadow could hide one of the creatures. Every sound of breaking brush could signal an attack. His water ran out after an hour of hard hiking. His legs cramped from the sustained effort, and his breathing became labored in the thin mountain air. But the sounds behind him never ceased, never fell behind. Whatever was following him had endurance that made his own fitness level seem pathetic by comparison. The forest began to change as he lost elevation. The massive old-growth trees gave way to younger timber, second growth that had sprung up after logging operations decades earlier. The canopy was lower here, more broken, allowing more light to reach the forest floor. Jack began to recognize landmarks from his morning hike, a distinctive snag here, a boulder there. The sounds behind him grew fainter. By the time Jack could see the glint of his truck's windshield through the trees, the forest had fallen silent again. He stopped at the edge of the logging road, breathing hard, and looked back the way he'd come. Nothing moved among the trees. No sounds reached his ears except the distant call of a hawk and the whisper of wind through the branches. But he could feel them watching. Jack holstered his rifle and walked the final 100 yards to his truck on unsteady legs. His hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine turned over immediately, filling the morning quiet with the familiar rumble of the V8. He'd never heard a more beautiful sound. As he backed out of the parking spot, Jack caught a glimpse of movement in his rearview mirror. Something large and dark stepped out onto the logging road behind him, watching his retreat. Even at this distance, he could see the unmistakable shape of the creature he'd encountered in the clearing. It stood there until his truck disappeared around a bend, then melted back into the forest like it had never been there at all. The drive back to town passed in a blur. Jack's hands remained locked on the steering wheel, his eyes checking the mirrors constantly for any sign of pursuit. But the mountain road remained empty, winding down through the foothills toward the Willamette Valley and civilization. It wasn't until he reached the outskirts of Sandy that Jack began to shake. The adrenaline that had kept him moving through the encounter finally wore off, leaving him exhausted and nauseated. He pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat in his truck for 20 minutes, trying to process what had happened to him in the woods above Mount Hood. By the time he reached his house in Gresham, Jack had almost convinced himself it had been a hallucination, some kind of stress reaction brought on by too much coffee and too little sleep. The mind playing tricks in the deep woods where shadows moved and sounds echoed strangely. Bears could walk upright for short distances, maybe that's all he'd seen. But when he unloaded his gear from the truck, Jack found something that made his hands start shaking again. His hunting pack, which he'd been wearing throughout the encounter, showed 3 parallel tears in the heavy canvas. The cuts were deep, going completely through the material and into the gear inside. They were spaced exactly the right distance apart to match the claws he'd seen on those massive hands. Jack stared at the damaged pack for a long time, running his fingers along the tears. He hadn't felt anything during the encounter, hadn't been aware of any contact with the creature. But somehow, at some point during that morning in the woods, something with very large claws had gotten close enough to touch him. He threw the pack in his garage and tried to forget about it. The nightmares started that night. Jack would wake up screaming, covered in sweat, his heart hammering as his mind replayed that moment when he'd looked up to see the massive creature standing over him. In his dreams, the encounter always ended differently. Sometimes the creature attacked, those huge hands closing around his throat. Sometimes it spoke, its voice a deep rumble that spoke of ancient forests and places where humans were not welcome. Sarah, his wife of 12 years, tried to be understanding at first. She made him chamomile tea and rubbed his shoulders when the dreams woke him up. But as the weeks passed and his sleep remained broken, her patience began to wear thin. "Maybe you should talk to someone," she suggested over breakfast one morning, watching him push eggs around his plate without eating. "Doctor Morrison might be able to help with the stress." Jack looked up at her, noting the dark circles under her eyes. His nightmares were keeping both of them awake. "I'm fine. It's just taking some time to process." "Process what?" "You went hunting and didn't see any elk. That's hardly traumatic." Jack had tried to tell her the truth that first night, describing his encounter in the clearing above Mount Hood. Sarah had listened with growing skepticism, her expression shifting from concern to doubt to barely concealed irritation. When he'd shown her the tears in his pack, she'd examined them briefly and pronounced them caught on a branch during his hike. "Canvas doesn't tear like that from a branch," Jack had insisted. "Look at the spacing. Look at how clean the cuts are. Then maybe you snagged it on barbed wire or a sharp rock. There are dozens of explanations that don't involve imaginary monsters." The word imaginary had stung more than Jack expected. He'd stopped trying to convince her after that, but the knowledge of what he'd experienced ate at him daily. He found himself researching Bigfoot sightings online, reading account after account of encounters in the Pacific Northwest. Some were obviously fake, written by attention seekers or people trying to make money from their stories. But others had a ring of truth that made his hands shake as he read them. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife had no record of any unusual wildlife sightings in the Mount Hood area during October. Jack called them 3 times, speaking with different biologists, but none of them took his story seriously. They suggested he'd encountered a black bear, possibly standing upright to get a better look at him. "Bears do that all the time," the last biologist explained patiently, "especially when they're curious about something. In the right lighting, with shadows and stress factors, it's easy to misjudge size and proportions." "This wasn't a bear," Jack said. "I've been hunting for 15 years. I know what a bear looks like." "I'm sure you do, Mr. Miller. But the mind can play tricks on us, especially when we're alone in the woods and something unexpected happens." Without any physical evidence, Jack had hung up without mentioning the tears in his pack. He'd already learned that people would explain away anything that didn't fit their worldview. 3 weeks after the encounter, Jack tried to return to normal hunting. Deer season was open, and Sarah encouraged him to get back out in the woods. Maybe a successful hunt would help him put the incident behind him. Jack drove to familiar territory in the Coast Range, places he'd hunted since he was a teenager. But he couldn't do it. Standing at the edge of the forest in the grey dawn light, Jack found himself paralyzed by memories of that morning on Mount Hood. Every shadow could hide something watching him. Every sound of breaking branches could signal the approach of something enormous and patient. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold his rifle steady. After 2 hours of sitting in his truck, Jack drove home without setting foot in the woods. "I think I'm done hunting," he told Sarah that evening. She looked up from her magazine, surprised. "You love hunting. It's been your passion since before I met you. Maybe it's time for new hobbies." "Because of what happened on Mount Hood? Jack, you need to let this go. You spooked yourself with shadows, and now you're letting it ruin something you've always enjoyed." Jack wanted to tell her about the tears in his pack again, about the intelligence in those eyes, about the way the creature had tried to communicate with him, but he'd learned that words couldn't convey the reality of what he'd experienced. People had to see it for themselves to believe it, and he wasn't sure he wanted anyone else to go through what he'd been through. That weekend, Jack listed his rifles for sale online. He got good prices for them, especially the Remington 700 that had been his primary hunting rifle for 8 years. The buyer was a young man from Portland who listened eagerly as Jack explained the rifle's history and capabilities. "Why are you selling it?" the young man asked. "This is a beautiful rifle, perfect for elk hunting." "I'm retired from hunting," Jack said simply. "Retired? You're what, 45? Most guys your age are just hitting their stride." Jack handed over the rifle case without responding. Some conversations weren't worth having. The calls started coming in December. Jack was watching television when his phone rang, the caller ID showing a number he didn't recognize. The man on the other end identified himself as Dave Paulson, a reporter for the Portland Tribune. "Mr. Miller, I'm calling about an incident you reported to the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife in October. Something about an unusual wildlife encounter near Mount Hood." Jack's stomach clenched. "I don't know what you're talking about. I have a copy of your report right here. You described encountering what you believed to be a Sasquatch or Bigfoot creature while hunting above the Palmer Creek drainage. I was wondering if you'd be willing to discuss your experience." "No comment." Jack hung up immediately. The phone rang again 5 minutes later. This time, it was a woman from a local television station, then another reporter from a Bigfoot research group, then someone claiming to represent a documentary film company. By evening, Jack had received 8 calls from people who had somehow gotten hold of his story. "How did they get my information?" he asked Sarah over dinner. "I thought those reports were confidential." Sarah looked at him with barely concealed exasperation. "You filed an official report claiming you saw Bigfoot. Did you really think that would stay quiet forever, especially after you called them 3 times to follow up?" "I never used the word Bigfoot. I described what I saw in factual terms." "Oh, come on, Jack. You described an 8-foot-tall bipedal creature covered in dark fur. What else were they supposed to think?" The reporters kept calling for 3 days. Jack stopped answering his phone, letting everything go to voicemail. Most of the messages were similar, requesting interviews about his Sasquatch encounter. A few were from people claiming to have had similar experiences, wanting to compare notes. One was from a cryptozoologist who offered to hypnotize Jack to help him remember additional details. On the fourth day, a van with television station logos parked outside Jack's house. "They're on our front lawn," Sarah said, peering through the bedroom curtains. "There's a reporter and a camera crew setting up equipment." Jack joined her at the window. A young woman in a red jacket was speaking into a microphone while a cameraman filmed her with the house in the background. He could see neighbors starting to come out of their houses to watch the spectacle. "This is insane," Sarah muttered. "You need to go talk to them. Tell them it was a mistake or a misunderstanding. Make this go away." Jack considered his options. He could deny everything, claim the reports were false or exaggerated. Most people would accept that explanation, would assume he'd simply gotten spooked in the woods and let his imagination run wild. It would end the media attention and let him return to his normal life. But it would also be a lie. Instead, Jack went outside to face the cameras. The reporter's name was Jennifer Walsh, and she seemed friendly enough as she explained what they wanted. Just a brief interview about his experience, nothing sensational. They were doing a story about increased Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest and wanted to include his account. "I understand you encountered what you believe was a Sasquatch while hunting near Mount Hood," Walsh said once the cameras were rolling. "Can you tell us what happened?" Jack found himself describing the encounter in clinical terms, sticking to observable facts. The footprint in the mud, the creature standing at the edge of the clearing, the intelligence in its eyes. He left out the emotional impact, the terror he'd felt, the way the experience had changed him. "How tall would you estimate the creature was?" Walsh asked. 8.5 feet, maybe 9. It was hard to judge exactly, but it was much larger than any human. "And you're certain it wasn't a bear?" "I've been hunting for 15 years. I know what a bear looks like. This was something else entirely." The interview lasted 10 minutes. Walsh seemed satisfied with his responses, though Jack could tell she was hoping for something more dramatic. She thanked him for his time and promised the story would air during the following week's evening news. Jack watched the news van pull away with a sense of resignation. He'd told his story as honestly as he could. Now, the whole city would know that Jack Miller from Gresham claimed to have seen Bigfoot in the woods above Mount Hood. The story aired on a Thursday evening. Jack and Sarah watched it together on their living room couch, neither speaking as Jack's face filled the television screen. The reporter had edited his interview down to about 2 minutes, focusing on the most dramatic elements. They'd included computer-generated graphics showing a large bipedal creature and dramatic music that made the whole thing seem like a science fiction movie. Local hunter Jack Miller says he came face-to-face with a Sasquatch in the Mount Hood National Forest. Walsh narrated over footage of the woods where Jack had been hunting. While skeptics dismiss such claims, Miller insists his encounter was real. The story concluded with a statement from a wildlife biologist explaining that people often misidentified bears or other known animals when they were frightened or stressed. The implication was clear. Jack Miller was either mistaken or lying. "Well," Sarah said when the story ended, "at least it's over now." But it wasn't over. The phone calls resumed the next morning, this time from people who had seen the television story. Most were believers who wanted to share their own experiences or ask for details about the location. A few were hostile, calling Jack a liar or a publicity seeker. One man called him a fraud and threatened to sue him for wasting taxpayer money on false reports. Jack's co-workers at the electrical supply company where he worked as a warehouse manager began treating him differently. Some were openly skeptical, making jokes about Bigfoot Jack and asking if he'd seen any UFOs lately. Others seemed genuinely interested, but approached him with the kind of careful courtesy usually reserved for the mentally ill. "You really saw one?" asked Tom Rodriguez, one of the drivers, cornering Jack by the coffee machine. "Like for real?" "I saw something," Jack replied carefully. "I'm not sure what it was." But you told the TV people it was Bigfoot. I described what I observed. I never used that term. Tom nodded knowingly. Right. Can't be too careful with the media. They twist everything around. The conversation made Jack realize how impossible his situation had become. If he insisted the encounter was real, people thought he was delusional. If he backtracked or qualified his statements, they assumed he was admitting it was false. There was no middle ground where the truth could exist. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Jack was loading inventory in the warehouse when his supervisor, Glenn Morrison, approached him with a concerned expression. Glenn was a decent man who had been Jack's boss for 6 years, but he looked uncomfortable as he gestured toward his office. Jack, we need to talk. They sat across from each other in the small office, Glenn shuffling papers nervously while Jack waited for him to speak. Look, Jack, this is awkward as hell, but I've been getting calls. People asking about you, about your stability, whether you're fit to be handling warehouse operations. What kind of calls? Reporters, mostly. But also some customers who saw that news story. They're concerned about your mental state, whether you're reliable. Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. Are you firing me? No, nothing like that. But maybe you should consider taking some time off. Let this media attention die down. Maybe talk to someone. Get some professional help dealing with the stress. Professional help. A counselor. Someone who specializes in trauma. What you experienced out there, whether it was real or imagined, it's clearly affected you. No shame in getting help. Jack stared at his supervisor, understanding finally dawning. Glenn thought he'd had some kind of breakdown in the woods. The official story was that Jack Miller had gotten lost and disoriented while hunting, possibly suffered from hypothermia or dehydration, and hallucinated the entire encounter. The fact that he continued to insist it was real only proved he needed psychiatric intervention. I'll think about it, Jack said. He cleaned out his desk that afternoon and never went back. Sarah filed for divorce in February. I can't do this anymore, she told him over dinner at a restaurant where they'd celebrated their anniversary for the past 5 years. You're not the man I married. Ever since that hunting trip, you've been obsessed with this fantasy. It's consuming your life. Jack pushed food around his plate, not trusting himself to speak. He'd known this was coming for weeks, could see it in the way Sarah looked at him, the careful distance she maintained even when they were in the same room. I've tried to be supportive, she continued, but you lost your job because of this delusion. You won't seek help. You spend hours online reading about monster sightings instead of looking for work. I feel like I'm living with a stranger. It wasn't a delusion. Listen to yourself, Jack. You're choosing to believe in monsters rather than accept that you had some kind of episode in the woods. Do you understand how that sounds to someone who loves you? Jack looked across the table at the woman he'd shared 12 years of his life with, seeing a stranger. Not because she had changed, but because the experience on Mount Hood had changed him in ways that couldn't be explained or undone. He was no longer the man who had driven up that mountain road in October, eager for a successful elk hunt. That man had been replaced by someone who knew there were things in the world that didn't fit into normal categories, things that existed outside the boundaries of accepted reality. I understand, he said finally. They divided their assets with minimal fighting. Sarah kept the house and most of the furniture. Jack took his truck, his tools, and enough money to get started somewhere new. He didn't contest the divorce or try to save the marriage. How could he explain to a judge that his wife was leaving him because he'd encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist? The local Bigfoot research groups kept in touch. Jack received regular emails from various cryptozoology organizations, inviting him to conferences and asking if he'd had any follow-up experiences. Most he deleted without reading, but a few he found intriguing. The Oregon Bigfoot Research Group seemed particularly professional, led by a retired forest ranger named Carl Erickson, who claimed to have documented hundreds of sightings over the past 30 years. "Your account is one of the most credible I've encountered," Erickson told Jack during a phone conversation in March. "Most people exaggerate or embellish their stories, but your description matches the behavior patterns we've observed in other encounters. Behavior patterns, the territorial nature, the way it escorted you out of the area rather than attacking, the apparent family group structure. These are consistent elements in credible sightings." Jack found himself oddly comforted by this information. The idea that he wasn't alone, that others had experienced similar encounters, made him feel less isolated in his knowledge. "Have you considered returning to the site?" Erickson asked. "We could organize an expedition, bring proper equipment, document any evidence that might still be there." The suggestion made Jack's hands shake. "I don't think that's a good idea." "I understand. Many witnesses are reluctant to return, but sometimes a follow-up visit can provide closure, help process the experience. I've processed it plenty. Have you? From what you've described, this encounter has cost you your job, your marriage, your peace of mind. That doesn't sound like healthy processing to me." Erickson was right, but Jack couldn't bring himself to consider returning to those woods. The thought of climbing back up that mountain, of possibly encountering the creatures again, filled him with a dread so deep it made him physically ill. He moved to Salem in April, renting a small apartment and finding work as a night security guard at a manufacturing plant. The job was perfect for someone who no longer trusted the dark corners of the world. He spent his shifts walking well-lit factory floors, checking doors and windows, ensuring that nothing unwanted gained entry to the orderly human environment. His neighbors didn't know about his claim to have seen Bigfoot. His co-workers didn't know. For the first time in months, Jack could have normal conversations with people who saw him as just another middle-aged guy trying to rebuild his life after a divorce. But the dreams continued. Not every night, but often enough to keep him from ever feeling truly rested. He would find himself back in that clearing above Mount Hood, staring into those intelligent eyes, feeling the weight of that massive presence. Sometimes the dreams were exact replicas of his actual experience. Other times they took disturbing turns, with the creature speaking in human language or revealing hidden intelligence that went far beyond what he'd observed. The worst dreams were the ones where he was the creature, seeing the forest from a height of 8.5 feet, smelling the complex scents that humans missed, hearing sounds beyond human perception. In these dreams, Jack understood with perfect clarity that humanity was just one species among many, not the dominant force they believed themselves to be. There were older inhabitants of the wilderness, creatures that had learned to avoid human contact but had never been conquered or driven away. He woke from these dreams with a profound sense of loss, as if he'd been expelled from paradise. Jack began taking sleeping pills in May, over-the-counter medications that promised deep, dreamless sleep. They helped for a while, dulling the intensity of his nightmares and allowing him to function better at work. But his tolerance built quickly, and soon he was taking twice the recommended dose with diminishing returns. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the psychiatrist recommended by his family physician, listened patiently as Jack described his symptoms: insomnia, anxiety, persistent nightmares, social withdrawal. He didn't mention the encounter on Mount Hood, describing his problems as stress-related following his divorce. "Have you experienced any unusual beliefs or perceptions lately?" Dr. Chen asked. "Things that others might find difficult to accept?" Jack recognized the question for what it was. Sarah or someone else had told the doctor about his Bigfoot claim. Nothing unusual. Sometimes people going through major life changes can experience episodes of altered perception. Stress, lack of sleep, and emotional trauma can create very convincing hallucinations. I understand. The important thing is to ground yourself in reality. Focus on observable facts rather than interpretations or impressions. Our minds can play tricks on us, especially when we're vulnerable. Dr. Chen prescribed antidepressants and anxiety medication, along with a sleep aid that promised to eliminate nightmares. The pills helped with the surface symptoms, but did nothing to address the fundamental problem. Jack knew something existed in the world that shouldn't exist, and that knowledge had no place in normal human life. The one-year anniversary of the encounter passed without incident. Jack worked his security shift as usual, walking the familiar routes through the factory, checking his watch as October 15th became October 16th. He'd half expected something to happen, some kind of supernatural anniversary event, but the night remained as ordinary as any other. But lying in bed the next morning, Jack realized that 12 months had passed without any resolution to his experience. He was no closer to understanding what he'd encountered or how to integrate that knowledge into his life. The creature remained as mysterious and impossible as ever, existing in a category that human society had no room for. The letter arrived in November. Jack found it waiting in his mailbox when he got home from his shift, his name and address written in block letters on plain white paper. No return address, no postmark. Someone had hand-delivered it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. Mr. Miller, I had a similar experience to yours near Mount Adams in 1987. If you would like to discuss it, I will be at Timberline Lodge on December 3rd at 2 p.m. Look for someone reading a book about Pacific Northwest geology. Robert Hendricks. Jack read the note 3 times, studying the handwriting for clues about the sender. The paper was expensive, heavy stock that suggested someone with money. The handwriting was careful, educated, but it was the content that made his hands shake as he held the letter. Someone else had experienced what he'd experienced. Someone who had lived with the knowledge for over 30 years. December 3rd was a Saturday. Jack called in sick to work and drove up Highway 26 toward Mount Hood, retracing the route he'd taken that October morning over a year ago. But instead of turning off toward the Palmer Creek drainage, he continued to Timberline Lodge. The historic lodge sat at 6,000 feet on Mount Hood slopes, its massive timber frame and stone foundation designed to withstand the mountain's harsh weather. Jack had been there many times over the years, usually for family ski trips before his marriage started falling apart. Today it was nearly empty, most of the summer visitors gone, and the ski season not yet begun. He found Robert Hendricks in the lodge's main lobby, exactly where the letter had promised. A man in his 60s with silver hair and weathered features, reading a book titled Geology of the Cascade Range. He looked up when Jack approached, studying him with sharp blue eyes. "You're Miller. How did you know? You have the look. Same expression I see in the mirror some mornings, like you've seen something that doesn't fit." They moved to a quiet corner of the lobby, taking chairs near the massive stone fireplace. Hendricks ordered coffee for both of them, then sat back and studied Jack with obvious curiosity. "Tell me about your encounter," he said simply. Jack found himself describing the events of that October morning in more detail than he'd shared with anyone. Not just the observable facts he'd told the reporters and wildlife officials, but the emotional impact, the sense of intelligence he'd detected in the creature, the way the experience had shattered his understanding of the world. Hendricks listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if Jack were describing something familiar. When Jack finished, they sat in silence for several minutes. "Mount Adams, 1987, Hendricks said finally. "I was doing geological survey work, mapping rock formations for the Forest Service. Working alone, camping in remote areas for weeks at a time. I thought I was prepared for anything the wilderness could throw at me. His encounter had been different but fundamentally similar. A family group of 3 creatures, larger than humans, clearly intelligent, observing him from a distance over several days before finally approaching his camp. No direct communication, but unmistakable awareness and curiosity. The strangest part wasn't seeing them, Hendricks continued. It was how they made me feel. Like I was the one being studied, catalogued, filed away in some vast database of human behavior. They weren't afraid of me, just interested. Did you report it? Hendricks laughed bitterly. I was a government employee with security clearance working on sensitive geological projects. Reporting a Bigfoot sighting would have ended my career instantly, so I kept quiet and tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But you didn't imagine it. No more than you did. The problem is that our society has no framework for processing this kind of experience. We've decided these creatures don't exist, so anyone who claims to have seen them must be lying or delusional. There's no middle ground. Jack felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought tears to his eyes. For over a year, he'd carried the burden of his knowledge alone, convinced that he was either going insane or living in a world where no one else could understand what he'd experienced. How do you live with it? Jack asked. Carefully. I've learned to compartmentalize the experience, to function in normal society while acknowledging that there are things beyond normal understanding. It's not easy, but it's possible. Do you think they're still out there? I know they are. I've had 3 more encounters over the years, always in remote areas, always brief. They seem to have learned to avoid human contact for the most part, but they're still there, watching, waiting. Waiting for what? Hendricks shrugged. I don't know. Maybe for us to destroy ourselves and leave them in peace. Maybe for us to evolve enough to accept their existence. Maybe they're just living their lives, and we occasionally stumble into their world by accident. They talked for 3 hours, sharing details of their encounters, comparing observations, trying to make sense of experiences that defied rational explanation. By the time they parted, Jack felt like he'd found something he didn't know he'd been looking for, validation from someone who understood. There are others, Hendricks told him as they stood to leave. People who've had genuine encounters but learned to keep quiet about them. We're not organized or anything, but we stay in touch, help each other process the experience. He handed Jack a business card with only a phone number printed on it. Call me if you need to talk. Sometimes it helps to remind yourself that you're not crazy. Jack drove back to Salem feeling lighter than he had in months. The encounter on Mount Hood remained as mysterious and impossible as ever, but at least he was no longer alone with the knowledge. There were others who had seen what he'd seen, who carried the same burden of impossible truth. The nightmares became less frequent after that. Jack still dreamed of the forest sometimes, still found himself standing in that clearing, staring into those intelligent eyes. But the dreams were less terrifying now, more like memories than night terrors. He began to sleep without medication, waking rested instead of exhausted. His work performance improved. His supervisor noted that he seemed more focused, more alert during his shifts. Jack found himself engaging in normal conversations with his co-workers again, participating in the small social rituals of workplace life. But he never forgot what he'd seen in the woods above Mount Hood. On quiet nights, when the factory was empty and his footsteps echoed through the corridors, Jack would sometimes pause and listen to the silence. Beyond the hum of machinery and the distant sound of traffic, he could almost hear something else. The whisper of wind through old-growth timber, the crack of breaking branches, the deep rumble of voices speaking in languages older than human civilization. They were still out there, he knew, still watching from the shadows at the edge of human awareness. Most people would never see them, would never know they existed, but for those who stumbled accidentally into their domain, who looked into those intelligent eyes and recognized something profound and alien, the world would never look quite the same again. Jack had learned to live with that knowledge. It had cost him his marriage, his job, and his peace of mind, but it had also given him something most people never experienced: the certainty that the world contained mysteries far greater than human understanding. He was no longer the man who had driven up that mountain road on an October morning, eager for a successful elk hunt. That man had been replaced by someone who knew that humanity shared the wilderness with older, wiser inhabitants who had learned to remain invisible while watching their noisy neighbors with patient curiosity. Sometimes, usually late at night when the factory was quiet and his mind was free to wander, Jack wondered what would happen if the creatures ever decided to reveal themselves publicly. Would humanity accept their existence, or would fear and prejudice drive a campaign to hunt them down? He suspected he knew the answer, and it made him grateful that they remained hidden in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, living their lives beyond human interference. The torn hunting pack still hung in his storage unit, the 3 parallel tiers now faded but still visible. Jack visited it sometimes, running his fingers along the damaged canvas and remembering that moment when something incredible had touched his life and changed it forever. He never went hunting again. The forests of Oregon remained off-limits to him, not because he feared another encounter, but because he respected the privacy of the creatures who called those woods home. He'd stumbled into their domain once by accident, and they'd shown him mercy by allowing him to leave unharmed. Jack Miller would spend the rest of his life carrying the knowledge of what existed beyond the edge of human understanding, a secret too profound to share and too real to deny. It was a burden he'd learned to bear with something approaching grace, understanding finally that some truths were too large for normal society to contain. In the end, that had to be enough. The next case. The Northern Minnesota Encounter. Daniel Harris adjusted the shoulder strap of his rifle for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, the worn leather cutting into his jacket where the padding had compressed over 15 years of hunting seasons. The October air carried that sharp bite that meant winter wasn't far behind, and his breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the still morning air. Something felt different about the woods today, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The usual sounds seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He'd been coming to this same section of the Superior National Forest for over a decade, parking his rusted Ford pickup at the old logging road and hiking the 2 miles to his favorite stand. The area had always been productive for whitetail, with natural funnels created by dense thickets and a small creek that drew deer down from the ridgeline. Daniel knew every game trail, every fallen log, every cluster of birch trees in this stretch of wilderness. That's why the silence bothered him. Where were the red squirrels chattering their territorial disputes, the woodpeckers hammering against the dead aspen? Even the ever-present rustle of leaves from small birds foraging seemed absent. Daniel paused on the familiar trail, his worn hiking boots crushing the layer of frost-brittle leaves beneath them. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. He checked his watch. 6:47 a.m. Sunrise was still 20 minutes away, but there should have been some activity by now. Maybe a late-season storm had pushed the wildlife deeper into cover, though the weather forecast had called for clear skies and light winds. Perfect hunting conditions, according to every outdoor magazine he'd ever read. Daniel continued toward his tree stand, a simple ladder stand he'd positioned 15 feet up, a mature oak tree overlooking a natural clearing where multiple deer trails converged. The tree had been struck by lightning years ago, leaving it partially hollow but still alive, its remaining branches creating perfect cover for a hunter. As he approached the familiar landmark, something made him stop. The scent hit him first, a musky, organic smell that reminded him of wet dog mixed with something else he couldn't identify, something wild and unfamiliar. He'd spent enough time in the woods to recognize the usual odors: decomposing leaves, animal scat, the clean smell of pine. even the occasional whiff of a skunk or the sharper scent of fox urine. This was different, stronger, more primitive somehow. Daniel set down his rifle against the base of the oak and pulled out his small LED flashlight. The beam cut through the pre-dawn darkness, illuminating the base of his tree stand. Everything appeared normal. The metal steps he'd screwed into the trunk, the safety cable, the seat cushion he'd left strapped to the platform. But as he swept the light across the ground, something caught his attention. A depression in the soft earth near the creek bank, maybe 30 yards from his stand. Daniel approached cautiously, his flashlight beam focused on the ground. What he found made him blink hard and look again. A footprint. Not the cloven hooves of deer or the paw prints of bear, but something that looked disturbingly human-like, except for the size. The impression was enormous, at least twice the length of his own size 11 boot and significantly wider. He knelt beside the print, careful not to disturb it, and pulled out his phone to take a picture. The screen lit up, showing a low battery warning, 15% remaining. He'd forgotten to charge it the night before, distracted by preparations for the hunt. The camera flash illuminated the print for a brief moment, but when he looked at the image on his phone's screen, it was blurry and unclear. The autofocus had struggled in the low light, creating an image that could have been anything. Daniel tried to take another photo, but his phone's battery died completely, the screen going black with no warning. He cursed under his breath and shoved the useless device back into his pocket. Without the phone's light, he had to rely on his small flashlight to examine the print more closely. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever had made it was extremely heavy. Around the edges, he could make out what appeared to be toe marks, 5 distinct digits, like an oversized human foot, but with longer, more pronounced toes. The ball of the foot and heel were clearly defined, and there appeared to be a slight arch. No animal he was familiar with made tracks like this. Daniel stood up slowly, his knees protesting from the cold morning air. He swept his flashlight beam around the immediate area, looking for more prints. He found 2 more impressions, fainter than the first, but unmistakably similar, forming what appeared to be a walking pattern, heading northwest toward the denser forest. The stride length between prints was enormous, easily 6 feet, far longer than any human could manage in normal walking. The musky smell seemed stronger now, though that might have been his imagination. Daniel had read articles about bear behavior and knew that black bears could leave tracks that might be confused for something else, especially in soft ground. But bears didn't walk upright for any significant distance, and these prints showed no sign of claws, which would be prominent in any bear track. He returned to his tree stand and began climbing, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in his stomach. Probably just a large bear passing through, he told himself. Maybe the odd shape of the prints was caused by the soft, muddy ground distorting a normal bear track. It wouldn't be the first time he'd seen something in the woods that looked unusual until examined in daylight. From his perch, 15 feet above the ground, Daniel had a clear view of the small clearing and the various trails that deer used to access the creek. He settled into his routine, checking his rifle to ensure a round was chambered, adjusting his safety and arranging his gear within easy reach. The familiar ritual helped calm his nerves. As the sky began to lighten, the forest remained unnaturally quiet. No birds called out territorial claims or alarm calls. No squirrels chattered warnings about the human intruder. Even the usual rustling of leaves from small mammals seemed absent. Daniel had experienced quiet mornings before. Sometimes weather patterns or predator activity could suppress normal forest sounds. But this felt different, more complete, more wrong. The first hint of sunrise painted the sky a pale gray, filtered through the canopy of bare branches and the few remaining yellow leaves clinging to the birch trees. Daniel's breath was visible in the cold air, and he pulled his knit cap down further over his ears. His hands, despite the insulated gloves, were beginning to feel numb. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in any forest he knew. A low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from the northwest, from the direction the strange tracks had been heading. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a moan, but something in between. The sound was deep, resonant, and carried an emotional quality that raised the hair on the back of Daniel's neck. He turned toward the sound, rifle ready, though he wasn't sure what he expected to see. The noise lasted only a few seconds before fading away, leaving behind the same unnatural silence. Daniel strained his ears, listening for any follow-up sounds, but heard nothing except his own pulse beating in his ears. Black bears made various vocalizations, grunts, huffs, woofs, but this had been different. Longer, more complex, almost like a form of communication rather than simple animal sounds. Daniel had heard moose calls that could be deep and resonant, but this was the wrong season and the wrong habitat for bull moose. He remained motionless in his stand, watching the trail junction below and trying to identify the source of his growing unease. Professional hunters often talked about developing a sixth sense in the wilderness, an intuitive understanding of when something was out of place. Daniel had always been skeptical of such claims, preferring to rely on observable facts and practical experience. But sitting in his tree stand as the forest awakened around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. The sound came again, closer this time and from a slightly different direction. The same low, rumbling vocalization, but now it seemed to carry an almost questioning quality, as if whatever was making it was trying to locate something or someone. Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle and he clicked off the safety. Movement caught his eye through the trees, maybe 80 yards to the northwest, something large and dark moving between the trunks, too far away to identify clearly in the dim morning light. Daniel raised his rifle and peered through the scope, trying to get a better look. The 3 to 9x scope gathered more light than his naked eye, but whatever he'd seen had already disappeared behind a cluster of pine trees. Could have been a deer, he told himself, a large doe or small buck moving through the timber. The early morning light played tricks on perception, making everything appear larger and more ominous than it actually was. But deer didn't make sounds like the vocalization he'd heard, and they certainly didn't walk in a way that would create the enormous prints he'd found by the creek. Daniel lowered his rifle and checked his watch. 7:23 a.m. Full sunrise was still 15 minutes away, but there was enough light now to see clearly for 50 or 60 yards in most directions. If something large was moving through the forest, he should be able to spot it without difficulty. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of water moving over rocks in the creek. Daniel realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to breathe normally. His hands were sweating inside his gloves despite the cold air, and his heart rate had increased noticeably. This was ridiculous, he thought. 20 years of hunting in woods across Minnesota and Wisconsin, and he was getting spooked by some unusual tracks and a few strange sounds. But then he smelled it again. That musky, organic odor that reminded him of wet fur and something else he couldn't identify. The scent was definitely stronger now, carried on the slight breeze that had begun moving through the trees as the air temperature differential increased with the sunrise. Daniel had read enough hunting magazines to know that scent could be deceiving in the woods. Decomposing organic matter, stagnant water, even certain types of fungi could create unusual odors. His nose wasn't trained like a bloodhound's. Human olfactory senses were notoriously unreliable for identifying specific sources of smell in complex environments. The third vocalization was different, sharper, more urgent, and much closer. Daniel estimated the source at no more than 40 or 50 yards away, somewhere in the thick brush that bordered the creek. This time, the sound carried an unmistakable note of agitation or alarm, as if whatever was making it had detected his presence. Daniel remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Every hunting instinct he'd developed over 2 decades told him to stay motionless and wait for whatever was out there to reveal itself. Movement attracted attention. Stillness made human hunters nearly invisible to most wildlife. But this didn't feel like a normal hunting situation anymore. The animal sounds, the unusual tracks, the oppressive silence of the forest. Everything combined to create an atmosphere of wrongness that made Daniel's primitive brain scream warnings about danger. Branches snapped in the underbrush, the sharp cracks clearly audible in the still air. Something was moving through the thick cover, and from the sound of breaking wood, it was something substantial. Daniel turned slowly in his stand, trying to pinpoint the location of the movement without making any noise himself. The sound stopped abruptly, as if whatever was moving had suddenly become aware of the need for stealth. Daniel waited, his rifle ready, watching the edge of the brush line where the sounds had originated. Long minutes passed with no further noise, no additional movement. Then he saw it. A dark shape emerged from behind a cluster of pine trees, moving with a fluid, purposeful gait that didn't match any animal Daniel had ever observed. At first glance, it appeared to be walking upright, but that couldn't be right. Bears occasionally reared up on their hind legs to get a better view or to investigate scents, but they didn't walk long distances in that position. Daniel raised his rifle and looked through the scope, trying to get a clear view of whatever was moving through the trees. The magnification brought the figure closer, but shadows and intervening branches made it difficult to see details. What he could observe was disturbing. Whatever this was, it was huge and definitely moving on 2 legs, with a confident, balanced stride that suggested this was its natural locomotion. The creature moved behind another tree, disappearing from view. Daniel tracked its probable path with his scope, waiting for it to emerge in one of the small openings between the pine trunks. When it did, he got his first clear look. The thing was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, possibly more, with a massive muscular frame covered in dark hair or fur. Its proportions were wrong for a human, with longer arms, a broader chest, and a distinctly non-human head shape. But it walked upright with an ease and balance that no bear could maintain. Daniel's hands began to shake as adrenaline flooded his system. This couldn't be real. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank, wearing a costume to scare hunters. But the fluid movement, the size, the obvious weight and mass of the creature, no human could fake those characteristics convincingly. The creature stopped and turned in Daniel's direction as if it had detected his presence. Through his rifle scope, Daniel could see its face clearly for the first time. The features were ape-like, but larger and more robust than any primate he'd seen in zoos or documentaries. Dark, intelligent eyes reflected the morning light, and the overall expression suggested awareness and caution rather than the blank stare of a simple animal. For several long seconds, hunter and creature regarded each other across the forest clearing. Daniel realized he was holding his breath again and forced himself to breathe slowly and quietly. His finger rested on the rifle's trigger guard, well away from the trigger itself, as he'd been taught in hunter safety courses decades ago. The creature took a step forward, then another, moving with deliberate slowness, as if testing Daniel's reaction. Its gait was remarkably human-like, but with subtle differences. A longer stride, a different distribution of weight, arms that swung with more freedom than human proportions would allow. Daniel's mind raced through possible explanations. Escaped circus animal? But no circus used animals this large or trained them to walk upright. Government experiment? The idea was ridiculous, but his brain grasped for any rational explanation that didn't require accepting what his eyes were telling him. The creature continued its slow approach, now less than 60 yards away and clearly visible even without the rifle scope. Daniel could see the texture of its fur, the muscle definition in its shoulders and arms, the way its breath formed small clouds in the cold air. This was no costume, no hoax. Whatever this thing was, it was a living, breathing animal unlike anything in any biology textbook. Panic began to override Daniel's natural hunting instincts. Every rational thought in his mind insisted that what he was seeing was impossible, but the evidence of his senses was undeniable. The creature was real, it was massive, and it was approaching his position with obvious intention. Daniel's first instinct was to fire a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare the creature away. But his hunting training overrode that impulse. Firing a rifle in the forest without a clear target was dangerous and illegal. Besides, he wasn't certain a warning shot would discourage something this large and apparently fearless. The creature stopped again, this time only 40 yards away, and raised its head as if sampling the air currents. Daniel realized it was probably trying to catch his scent to determine exactly where he was positioned. The morning breeze was generally in Daniel's favor, but air currents in the forest could be unpredictable. Then the creature did something that sent ice through Daniel's veins. It cupped its hands around its mouth and released a loud, echoing call that reverberated through the forest. The sound was unlike anything Daniel had ever heard, a complex vocalization that seemed to combine elements of a howl, a roar, and something almost musical. The call lasted nearly 10 seconds before fading away, leaving behind an even more profound silence. Daniel understood instinctively that the creature was communicating, possibly calling to others of its kind. The thought that there might be more than one of these things in the forest made his blood run cold. If this was some unknown species of large primate, they might travel in groups like gorillas or chimpanzees. The answering call came from the northeast, maybe a quarter-mile away through the trees. A similar vocalization, but with subtle differences in tone and rhythm that suggested a different individual. Daniel's worst fears were confirmed. There were at least 2 of these creatures in the area, and they were communicating with each other. The creature below began moving again, but now its behavior had changed. Instead of the cautious, exploratory movement from before, it now showed purpose and direction. It was no longer just investigating the unusual scent of a human hunter. It was actively approaching Daniel's position with what appeared to be hostile intent. Daniel made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of remaining in his tree stand like a sitting duck, he began climbing down as quickly and quietly as possible. His hands shook as he gripped the metal ladder steps, and twice he nearly lost his footing on the frost-slick rungs. As his boots touched the ground, Daniel grabbed his rifle and looked around for the creature. It had disappeared again, vanishing into the forest with a silence that seemed impossible for something so large. But Daniel could still smell that musky, organic odor, stronger now and definitely closer. He began moving toward his truck, trying to balance speed with stealth. The 2-mile hike back to the logging road had never seemed so far. Every shadow between the trees could be hiding a massive predator. Every sound could be the approach of something that shouldn't exist. Daniel had covered maybe 300 yards when he heard branches breaking behind him, the sharp cracks of wood under enormous weight. Whatever was following him wasn't bothering with stealth anymore. He broke into a jogging pace, his rifle clutched across his chest, his breathing already becoming labored from the combination of fear and exertion. The sounds behind him grew closer, and Daniel realized that whatever was pursuing him could move much faster through the forest than he could. His only advantage was his knowledge of the terrain and a head start that was rapidly disappearing. He reached the small creek that paralleled the trail for part of the route back to his truck. The water was shallow but ice cold, and the rocks were slippery with frost and algae. Daniel splashed across without bothering to find the usual stepping stones, soaking his boots and lower legs. As he climbed up the opposite bank, a tremendous crashing sound erupted from the forest behind him. Trees were being pushed aside or broken completely, and the noise was getting closer by the second. Daniel abandoned any pretense of stealth and ran. His hunting experience had included plenty of physical conditioning, long hikes carrying heavy gear, climbing into and out of tree stands, dragging deer carcasses through rough terrain. But this was different. This was running for his life through dense forest while carrying a rifle and wearing heavy hunting clothing. Daniel's lungs burned in the cold air and his legs already felt heavy. He was in decent shape for a 43-year-old man, but he was no marathon runner. And whatever was behind him showed no signs of tiring or slowing down. He reached a familiar landmark, a lightning-struck pine tree that marked the halfway point to his truck. 1 mile to go, but it was the most difficult mile of the trail, including a steep climb over a rocky ridge and a descent through thick underbrush that slowed normal walking to a careful pace. Daniel paused for just a moment to catch his breath and listen for his pursuer. The forest had returned to that unnatural silence, with no sound of breaking branches or heavy footfalls. But the musky scent was stronger than ever, so strong it almost made him gag. A low growl came from his left, maybe 30 yards away through the trees. Daniel spun toward the sound and caught a glimpse of something large and dark moving parallel to his position. The creature wasn't just chasing him, it was trying to get ahead of him, to cut off his route to the truck. Panic overrode rational thought. Daniel broke into a dead run, crashing through underbrush and low branches without regard for noise or the thorns that tore at his jacket and face. He had to reach his truck before the creature could get between him and the vehicle. The ridge climb was a nightmare of loose rocks and steep terrain. Daniel's boots slipped repeatedly on the frost-covered stone, and he had to use his rifle as a makeshift walking stick to maintain his balance. Behind him, he could hear something large moving through the forest, but the sounds seemed to be maintaining distance rather than getting closer. At the top of the ridge, Daniel risked a look back. Through the bare trees, he could see movement in the shadows, something large keeping pace with him, but staying just out of clear sight. The creature was definitely following him, but its behavior had changed again. Instead of direct pursuit, it seemed to be herding him, keeping him moving in a specific direction. The thought that this thing might be intelligent enough to use hunting tactics made Daniel's blood run cold. If it was trying to drive him toward other members of its group, he could be running straight into a trap. But he had no choice except to continue toward his truck. Any other direction would take him deeper into the wilderness, farther from help and civilization. Daniel began the descent down the backside of the ridge, using trees and rocks to control his speed on the steep slope. Halfway down the ridge, his right foot caught on a root, hidden under the layer of fallen leaves. Daniel pitched forward, his rifle flying from his hands as he tried to break his fall. He hit the ground hard, rolling several times before slamming into the trunk of a large oak tree. Pain shot through his left shoulder and ribs where he'd impacted the tree. Daniel lay still for a moment, assessing the damage. His shoulder throbbed, but he could move his arm. His ribs were tender but didn't feel broken. Cuts on his face and hands from thorns and branches stung in the cold air. His rifle had landed 10 feet away, the wooden stock showing a fresh crack where it had struck a rock. Daniel crawled over to retrieve it, hoping the impact hadn't damaged the scope or knocked the gun out of alignment. As he reached for the rifle, a shadow fell across him. Daniel looked up to see the creature standing at the edge of the trees, not 20 yards away. This close, the thing was even more imposing than it had appeared through his rifle scope. 8.5 feet tall at least, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad and arms that hung nearly to its knees. The creature's face was a mixture of human and ape characteristics, but scaled up to massive proportions. Dark, intelligent eyes watched Daniel with what appeared to be curiosity rather than immediate aggression. Its entire body was covered in dark brown hair that looked thick and coarse, perfect insulation for Minnesota winters. Daniel's hand closed around his rifle, but he made no sudden movements. At this distance, the creature could cover the 20 yards between them in a couple of seconds. His only chance was to avoid triggering an attack. The creature tilted its head slightly, studying Daniel with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful. Its breathing was visible in the cold air, and Daniel could hear the deep, regular rhythm of its respiration. The musky scent was overwhelming now, a combination of wet fur, organic decay, and something else, something wild and primitive that triggered every alarm in Daniel's evolutionary memory. For nearly a minute, they regarded each other in silence. Daniel remained frozen on the ground, afraid that any movement might provoke an attack. The creature seemed content to observe, showing no signs of aggression, but also no indication that it intended to leave. Then, without warning, the creature opened its mouth and released a deafening roar that seemed to shake the ground beneath Daniel's body. The sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard, deeper than a lion's roar, more powerful than a bear's bellow, with an emotional intensity that spoke of intelligence and controlled fury. Daniel's nerve broke completely. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his shoulder and ribs, and ran. Behind him, he could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush in pursuit, no longer bothering with stealth or tactical positioning. The final half-mile to his truck was a blur of terror and adrenaline. Daniel ran harder than he'd ever run in his life, his lungs burning and his heart hammering against his ribs. Branches whipped across his face, and twice he stumbled, but managed to keep his feet. The old logging road appeared ahead through the trees like a vision of salvation. Daniel's rusted Ford pickup sat exactly where he'd left it, covered with frost, but beautiful in its familiarity and promise of escape. Daniel reached the truck and yanked on the driver's door handle. The door was locked. In his panic that morning, preparing for what he'd thought would be a normal hunting trip, he'd automatically locked the vehicle out of urban habit. Now his keys were somewhere in his jacket pockets, and his hands were shaking too badly to find them quickly. The sound of breaking branches was getting closer. Daniel could hear the creature's heavy breathing, could smell that overwhelming musky odor carried on the morning breeze. His fingers finally found the key ring, but he dropped it twice before managing to get the key into the lock. The truck door opened just as something large burst from the tree line 30 yards away. Daniel didn't look back. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and hit the lock button. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the ignition key into position. The truck's engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a rumbling roar that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. Daniel threw the transmission into drive and pressed the accelerator, not caring about the spinning tires on the frost-slick ground. In his rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of the creature standing in the middle of the logging road, watching his retreat. Even at 50 yards and growing distance, the thing looked enormous and undeniably real. Daniel drove the 12 miles back to the main highway in a state of shock, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Twice he had to pull over when waves of nausea overwhelmed him, his body's delayed reaction to the massive adrenaline dump. When he reached the town of Grand Marais, Daniel drove straight to the Cook County Sheriff's Department. The building was a modest brick structure that served the sparsely populated county, staffed by officers who dealt mostly with traffic violations, domestic disputes, and the occasional break-in. Sheriff's Deputy Lisa Kowalski was working the Saturday morning shift, preparing reports and drinking coffee while waiting for the phone to ring. She looked up with mild interest when Daniel walked through the front door, noting his disheveled appearance and the wild look in his eyes. "Can I help you?" Deputy Kowalski asked, setting down her coffee mug. Daniel struggled to find words that wouldn't make him sound completely insane. "I need to report an encounter with an unknown animal in the Superior National Forest," he finally said. Deputy Kowalski reached for an incident report form. "What kind of animal?" Bear. Wolf? I don't know what it was, Daniel said. Something I've never seen before. Large, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, walking on 2 legs, it chased me for over a mile through the forest. The deputy's pen stopped moving. She looked up at Daniel with a mixture of skepticism and concern. Walking on 2 legs. Are you sure it wasn't a bear rearing up to get a better look at you? No, Daniel said firmly. This thing walked upright like a human, but it was massive, covered in dark hair, with a face that looked like a cross between a human and an ape. Deputy Kowalski set down her pen and studied Daniel's face. She'd been a law enforcement officer for 8 years and had developed a good sense for distinguishing between genuine witnesses and people with mental health issues or substance abuse problems. Daniel appeared sober and rational, but his story was clearly impossible. Have you been drinking this morning, Mr. Harris? Daniel Harris. And no, I haven't been drinking. I know how this sounds, but I'm telling you what I saw. The deputy made a note on her form. Where exactly did this occur? Daniel provided the location as specifically as he could, describing the logging road where he'd parked and the general area where the encounter had taken place. Deputy Kowalski wrote down the information but made no commitment to investigate. We'll file this report, she said. If other people report similar sightings in that area, we might contact the Department of Natural Resources to see if there are any known wildlife issues. Daniel could tell from her tone that the report would go into a file and be forgotten. There were tracks, he said. Large footprints by the creek. Someone should go look at them. I'll make a note of that, Deputy Kowalski said, though her expression suggested she had no intention of hiking into the forest to look for unusual tracks. Daniel left the sheriff's office feeling frustrated and alone. He drove home to his small house on the outskirts of Grand Marais, parked in his driveway, and sat in the truck for several minutes, trying to process what had happened. The rational part of his mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation. Stress, sleep deprivation, an overactive imagination triggered by unusual but perfectly normal forest sounds and shadows. People didn't encounter unknown species of large primates in the forests of Minnesota, but the physical evidence contradicted his rational mind. His jacket was torn in several places from running through thorns and branches. His face and hands showed scratches from the same mad dash through the underbrush. His rifle stock was cracked from the fall on the ridge. Something had definitely happened in the forest, something that had terrified him enough to run for his life. Daniel went inside and tried to return to normal activities. He cleaned his rifle, inspected the cracked stock, and confirmed that the scope was still properly aligned. He treated the cuts on his face and hands with antiseptic. He made coffee and attempted to eat breakfast, but found that his appetite had completely disappeared. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the creature's face, those dark, intelligent eyes studying him with unmistakable awareness. The image was burned into his memory with a clarity that suggested trauma rather than imagination. By afternoon, Daniel had made a decision. He called his brother Mike, who lived in Duluth and had been Daniel's hunting partner for 15 years. Mike was a practical man, a mechanical engineer who approached problems with logic and systematic analysis. I need you to come up here, Daniel said without preamble. What's wrong? Mike asked. You sound terrible. Daniel summarized the morning's events, trying to stick to observable facts and avoid speculation. Mike listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about timing or specific details. You're serious about this, Mike said when Daniel finished. Completely serious. I know how it sounds, but something happened out there that I can't explain. Have you considered the possibility that it was a person in a costume? Maybe someone trying to create a viral video or play a prank. The size was wrong, Daniel said, and the way it moved. No human could fake that kind of fluid movement while wearing a bulky costume. Plus, there were multiple vocalizations from different locations. Mike was quiet for a moment. "I can drive up tomorrow morning. We'll go back to the area and look for those tracks you mentioned." "I'm not sure I want to go back there," Daniel admitted. "If there really is some unknown animal in the forest, other people need to know about it," Mike said. "And if there's a rational explanation, you need to find it for your own peace of mind." That evening, Daniel tried to research similar encounters online. He found hundreds of stories from across North America, reports of large bipedal creatures in forested areas. Most of the accounts were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but the consistency of descriptions across different regions and time periods was striking. The creatures were always described as large, hair-covered, and walking upright. Witnesses consistently reported an overwhelming musky odor. The creatures were said to be extremely elusive, avoiding human contact except when surprised or cornered. And in nearly every case, physical evidence was minimal or quickly degraded. Daniel read account after account, looking for details that matched his own experience. The vocalizations he'd heard were described by other witnesses, sometimes as howls, sometimes as complex calls that suggested communication. The intelligence he'd observed in the creature's eyes was mentioned repeatedly by other people who claimed similar encounters. But Daniel also noticed that most of the online reports came from sources that were obviously biased toward believing in the existence of such creatures. Cryptozoology websites, paranormal forums, and sensationalized documentary programs that treated every unsubstantiated claim as potential evidence. The scientific literature was less encouraging. While new species of animals were discovered regularly, they were typically small creatures in remote locations. The idea that a population of large primates could exist in North American forests without leaving clear evidence was considered highly unlikely by mainstream zoologists. Daniel went to bed that night but couldn't sleep. Every sound outside his house, wind in the trees, a car passing on the street, the neighbor's dog barking, made him alert and anxious. The logical part of his mind insisted he was safe in his own home, but his primitive brain remained convinced that something dangerous was lurking in the darkness. Mike arrived the next morning with a digital camera, a GPS unit, and a skeptical but open mind. Daniel led him back to the logging road where the encounter had begun, pointing out the location where he'd parked his truck and the direction he'd hiked to his tree stand. The forest looked different in the clear morning light, less ominous but somehow smaller than Daniel remembered. The creek where he'd found the unusual tracks was only a 10-minute walk from the road, much closer than it had seemed during his panicked retreat. They found the area where Daniel had discovered the first footprint, but 2 days of wind and occasional light rain had degraded any clear impressions. Mike photographed several depressions in the soft ground near the creek, but none showed the clear details Daniel remembered. "It was right here," Daniel said, pointing to a spot that now showed only vague irregularities in the mud. The print was enormous with clear toe marks. Mike examined the area carefully, measuring the depressions and taking photographs from multiple angles. "There's definitely something here," he said, "but it's not clear enough to identify what made these marks." They followed the path Daniel had taken during his retreat, looking for additional evidence. Mike found several broken branches that could have been caused by something large passing through the forest, but branches broke for many reasons: storms, falling trees, normal animal activity. At the ridge where Daniel had fallen, they found scuff marks in the dirt and a few drops of dried blood from the cuts on Daniel's face. Mike photographed these as well, though they only confirmed that Daniel had been injured during a fall, not what had caused him to fall. "I'm not finding anything that proves your story," Mike said carefully, "but I'm also not finding anything that disproves it." They spent 3 hours in the forest, retracing Daniel's route and examining the areas where he'd reported seeing or hearing the creature. Mike approached the investigation with scientific methodology, documenting everything they found and maintaining detailed notes about locations and timing. By the time they returned to Daniel's truck, Mike had filled 2 notebooks with observations and taken over 100 photographs. But the evidence was frustratingly ambiguous, suggestive of something unusual, but not conclusive enough to support any specific explanation. "What do you think?" Daniel asked as they drove back toward town. Mike was quiet for several minutes, reviewing his notes. "I think something happened to you out there," he finally said. "Your physical injuries are real, your emotional state is consistent with a traumatic experience, and there are some unusual signs in the forest that don't have obvious explanations. But there's nothing that couldn't be explained by a combination of environmental factors and psychological stress. You've been hunting alone for 20 years, you've been under work pressure lately, and you were in an isolated environment where the mind can play tricks." Daniel felt a familiar surge of frustration. "You think I imagined the whole thing?" "I think you experienced something that terrified you," Mike said. "Whether that something was objectively real or a product of your mental state under stress, I can't determine from the available evidence." They returned to Daniel's house and spent the afternoon reviewing Mike's photographs on his laptop computer. The images showed ambiguous depressions in mud, broken branches, and various forest debris, but nothing that clearly supported Daniel's account of encountering an unknown creature. "Even if I had gotten clear photographs or video," Daniel said, "people would just claim it was a hoax. Every piece of evidence gets dismissed as fake or misidentified." "That's the nature of extraordinary claims," Mike replied. "They require extraordinary evidence, and extraordinary evidence is exactly what's always missing from these types of encounters." Mike drove back to Duluth that evening, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts and memories. The rational investigation had failed to provide the validation Daniel had hoped for, but it also hadn't completely debunked his experience. Over the following weeks, Daniel found himself changed by the encounter in ways he hadn't expected. His enthusiasm for hunting disappeared completely. The thought of spending time alone in the forest triggered anxiety attacks that left him sweating and short of breath. He sold his rifle and hunting equipment, telling friends that he'd lost interest in the sport. He avoided the outdoor sports store where he'd shopped for 20 years, unable to face the displays of camouflage clothing and hunting accessories that reminded him of that morning in the forest. Daniel's sleep patterns remained disrupted. He installed motion sensor lights around his house and found himself checking the locks on his doors multiple times each night. Every unexplained sound outside made him alert and nervous. At work, his concentration suffered. Daniel was a skilled carpenter who took pride in precise measurements and quality craftsmanship, but he found himself making careless mistakes and losing focus on projects that should have been routine. His friends and family began to express concern about the changes in his behavior. Daniel's ex-wife Sarah called to check on him after their teenage daughter mentioned that her father seemed different during their weekend visits. "Emma says you won't go camping anymore," Sarah said during an awkward phone conversation. "You two used to love those fishing trips to the Boundary Waters." Daniel struggled to explain his reluctance to spend time in the wilderness without revealing the real reason. "I've just been busy with work," he said lamely. "She also says you jump every time a door slams or a car backfires. Are you having some kind of health problems?" Daniel considered telling Sarah about the encounter, but he knew how she would react. Their marriage had ended partly because of Sarah's frustration with what she called Daniel's stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality. She would view his story as another example of his inability to distinguish between facts and fantasies. "I'm fine," Daniel said. "Just dealing with some stress at work." But Daniel wasn't fine, and the stress wasn't from work. He was dealing with the psychological aftermath of an experience that had fundamentally challenged his understanding of reality. Everything he'd believed about the natural world, about the limits of what was possible, had been called into question by 15 minutes in a Minnesota forest. Daniel began seeing a counselor, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, who specialized in treating anxiety disorders and trauma. He told her about experiencing a severe panic attack while hunting, but didn't mention the specific details of what had triggered the attack. Panic attacks can be caused by a variety of factors, Dr. Martinez explained during their third session. Sometimes they're triggered by specific phobias, sometimes by general stress, and sometimes they seem to come out of nowhere. Daniel appreciated the counselor's matter-of-fact approach to his symptoms, but he felt guilty about not providing complete information about their cause. How could he explain that his panic attacks were triggered by the memory of encountering a creature that wasn't supposed to exist? Have you considered the possibility that your mind is protecting you from remembering something traumatic that happened during your hunting trip? Dr. Martinez asked. Sometimes our brains block out details of experiences that are too disturbing to process normally. The suggestion made Daniel uncomfortable. Was it possible that his memory of the encounter was a distortion of some other traumatic event? Could his mind have constructed the impossible creature as a way of avoiding a more mundane but equally disturbing reality? But Daniel's recollection of the encounter remained vivid and consistent. Every detail was clear in his memory: the creature's appearance, its movements, the sounds it made, the overwhelming musky odor. If his mind had fabricated the experience, it had done so with remarkable consistency and attention to detail. 3 months after the encounter, Daniel received a phone call from Deputy Kowalski at the Cook County Sheriff's Department. Another hunter had reported an unusual sighting in the same general area of the Superior National Forest. "I wanted you to know that your report from October is getting some additional attention," Deputy Kowalski said. "We've had 2 more calls about unusual animal activity in that area." Daniel felt a mixture of vindication and renewed anxiety. "What kind of reports?" "Similar to yours, actually. Large, unidentified animals, unusual sounds, that sort of thing. The Department of Natural Resources is going to investigate, see if there might be an injured bear or something that's behaving abnormally." "Do you want me to talk to these other witnesses?" Daniel asked. "That's not necessary," Deputy Kowalski said. "But I wanted you to know that you weren't the only person to report something unusual in that area." After the call, Daniel felt a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, additional reports suggested that his experience might have been real rather than imaginary. On the other hand, the possibility that the creature was still in the area, still encountering other people, brought back all of his anxiety about the encounter. Daniel never returned to that section of the Superior National Forest. He occasionally read local news reports about unusual wildlife sightings, but the stories were always vague and quickly disappeared from public attention. The Department of Natural Resources investigation apparently found no evidence of abnormal animal activity. 6 months after the encounter, Daniel had developed coping strategies that allowed him to function normally in most situations. He avoided forested areas and declined invitations to outdoor activities, but he'd learned to manage his anxiety through breathing exercises and medication prescribed by his doctor. Daniel's relationship with his daughter Emma improved once he stopped trying to hide his reluctance to go camping. He explained that he'd had a bad experience while hunting and wasn't comfortable in the wilderness anymore. Emma, who was 14 and more interested in social media than outdoor activities anyway, accepted this explanation without question. But late at night, when Daniel lay in bed listening to the wind in the trees outside his house, he sometimes wondered what would have happened if he'd stayed in his tree stand that morning instead of climbing down and running. Would the creature have approached more closely? Would it have tried to communicate? The questions tormented him because he knew he would never have answers. The encounter had lasted less than 20 minutes, but it had changed the trajectory of his entire life. Daniel Harris, who had once been completely comfortable in the wilderness, would never again feel safe in the deep forest. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the Superior National Forest, something large and unknown continued to move through the shadows between the trees, avoiding human contact, but occasionally crossing paths with hunters and hikers who would return to civilization with impossible stories that no one would believe. Daniel kept the cracked rifle stock in his garage, the only physical evidence of his encounter. Sometimes he would hold it and run his fingers over the damaged wood, remembering the weight of the rifle in his hands, and the moment when panic had caused him to drop it during his desperate flight through the forest. The crack in the wood was real, his memories were real. But whether the creature that had chased him through the Minnesota wilderness was real remained a question that would haunt Daniel Harris for the rest of his life. The file containing Daniel's report remained in the Cook County Sheriff's Department marked Animal Encounter, Unresolved. Deputy Kowalski occasionally mentioned the case to other officers, usually as an example of how isolation and stress could affect people's perceptions in the wilderness. But late at night, when she was alone in the office, Deputy Kowalski sometimes looked out at the dark forest that surrounded the small town and wondered what might be out there, moving through the shadows beyond the reach of human understanding. The Superior National Forest covered over 3 million acres of wilderness, most of it unexplored and unmapped. If something large and elusive wanted to remain hidden in that vast expanse of forest, it would have little difficulty avoiding human detection. And in the scientific community, researchers continued to debate the possibility that unknown species of large primates might exist in remote areas of North America. The fossil record showed that giant apes had once lived on the continent, and new species of animals were discovered regularly in isolated ecosystems around the world. But for Daniel Harris, the academic debates and theoretical possibilities were irrelevant. He knew what he had seen in the forest that October morning, and that knowledge had changed him in ways that would never be completely healed. The creature's eyes, dark, intelligent, and undeniably aware, remained burned into his memory. Whatever it was, wherever it had come from, it had looked at Daniel with the unmistakable recognition of one conscious being encountering another. And that recognition, that moment of contact between human and unknown, was something Daniel would carry with him until the day he died. The forest kept its secrets, as it always had. But for those who ventured deep enough into the wilderness, those who lingered too long in places where humans were temporary visitors, there was always the possibility of an encounter that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the natural world. Daniel Harris had wanted nothing more than a quiet morning of deer hunting in the familiar woods of northern Minnesota. Instead, he had stumbled into a mystery that human science was not yet equipped to solve. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Superior National Forest, something large and unknown continued its ancient existence, moving through the shadows between the trees, avoiding human contact, but occasionally leaving traces of its passage for those bold enough or foolish enough to look. The story of Daniel's encounter would become part of the local folklore, retold in hunting camps and fishing lodges throughout northern Minnesota. Most listeners would dismiss it as imagination or exaggeration, but a few would nod knowingly and share their own stories of strange sounds and unusual tracks found in remote areas of the forest. The wilderness remained wild, keeping its deepest secrets hidden in the shadows beneath the canopy, where ancient mysteries continued to exist beyond the reach of human understanding. And Daniel Harris, forever changed by 15 minutes of terror in a Minnesota forest, would spend the rest of his life wondering what he had really seen on that cold October morning, when something impossible had stepped out of the trees and into his world. The next case. The silence in the pines. Caleb Whitehorse crouched beside the fallen cottonwood, his hunting knife steady as he worked the rabbit's hide free from the muscle beneath. The October air in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains carried the bite of coming winter, and his breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the thin atmosphere. At 8,000 feet, even his Navajo heritage couldn't completely ward off the cold that seeped through his worn canvas jacket. The rabbit had been clean shot, taken just after dawn, when it emerged from a thicket of scrub oak to nibble at the frost-covered grass. Caleb had been hunting these mountains for 37 years, since his grandfather first brought him up from the reservation when he was 12. Now, at 49, he could read the forest like others read newspapers, understanding the subtle language of wind through pine needles and the territorial calls of Clark's nutcrackers echoing off granite faces. His truck was parked 3 miles down the old logging road, loaded with camping gear for what was supposed to be a 5-day hunt. Sarah had kissed him goodbye at their small house in Espanola, reminding him to check in when he reached base camp. That had been yesterday evening. He'd made good time up the mountain, setting up his tent in a familiar clearing where a seasonal creek provided fresh water, and the surrounding ponderosa pines offered shelter from the worst of the mountain winds. The rabbit's fur peeled away cleanly under his blade. Caleb had learned to skin game from his grandfather, who'd learned from his grandfather before him. The old man used to say that taking an animal's life created a debt that could only be repaid through respect and waste of nothing. Every part of this rabbit would serve a purpose. The meat for tonight's dinner, the hide for winter mittens Sarah had been asking about, even the bones would go into the fire to ensure the spirit found its way home. Something changed in the forest around him. It took Caleb a moment to identify what felt different. The wind still moved through the canopy overhead, causing the massive pine trunks to creak and sway with their ancient rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, a Steller's jay called to its mate. But underneath these familiar sounds, something crucial was missing. The small sounds had stopped. No squirrels chattered in the branches, no chipmunks rustled through the fallen leaves searching for pine nuts. The constant whisper of small birds moving through the underbrush had ceased entirely. Even the buzz of late-season flies that should have been attracted to the rabbit's blood was absent. Caleb's knife paused mid-stroke. In 3 decades of hunting, he'd learned to trust these subtle warnings. Predators moved through the forest in bubbles of silence, their presence announced by the absence of the prey animals that constituted the mountain's background chorus. A black bear or mountain lion could cause this kind of reaction, but something about this silence felt different, deeper, more complete. He lifted his head slowly, letting his eyes sweep the tree line without moving his neck. His grandfather had taught him this too. Sudden movements drew attention, but predators often missed careful observation. The forest around him appeared normal. Shafts of golden sunlight slanted through the canopy, illuminating dust motes and the gentle drift of pine pollen. Nothing moved among the widely spaced tree trunks except the play of light and shadow. But the silence held. Caleb's heartbeat picked up slightly, though he couldn't say why. He was armed. A .30-06 rifle leaned against a nearby boulder, loaded and ready. His grandfather's old Colt .45 rode in a holster on his hip. A weight he'd carried for so many years, he rarely noticed it anymore. Both weapons had served him well over the decades, dropping everything from white-tailed deer to the occasional black bear that wandered too close to his camps. The rabbit's partially skinned carcass lay across his knees, blood still warm on his hands. Whatever was out there would smell it, of course. Fresh blood carried for miles in the thin mountain air, and most predators in these mountains were opportunistic enough to investigate. But this felt different from the usual competitive tension that came when bears or cats detected a successful hunt. He resumed his work with the knife, but kept his movements economical and quiet. The hide separated cleanly from the muscle, and he found himself working faster than usual, driven by an instinct he couldn't name. 37 years in these mountains had taught him that when the forest spoke, smart men listened. Right now, the forest was screaming danger in the loudest silence he'd ever heard. A stick broke somewhere behind him and to his left. Caleb froze completely, the knife halfway through separating a particularly stubborn section of hide. The sound had been unmistakable, the sharp crack of deadwood under significant weight. Not the scurrying scramble of a deer or elk, which would have been accompanied by the rattle of disturbed brush and the quick percussion of hooves on stone. This had been a single, deliberate step. He waited, controlling his breathing and listening with every fiber of his being. Seconds stretched into a full minute. No follow-up sounds came, but the silence in the forest deepened until it felt almost physical, like a weight pressing against his eardrums. Slowly, carefully, Caleb turned his head toward the sound. The slope behind him rose gradually through scattered boulders and clumps of scrub oak before disappearing into a dense stand of aspen trees about 60 yards away. Their leaves had turned golden weeks ago, and now most had fallen, leaving the white bark of their trunks clearly visible against the darker evergreens behind them. Nothing moved among them, but something had been there. He was certain of it. Caleb finished skinning the rabbit with quick practice strokes, then wrapped the meat in the hide and secured the bundle with a piece of paracord from his pack. His hands moved automatically through the familiar routine, while his attention remained focused on the tree line. Every few seconds, he paused to listen, but the unnatural silence persisted. When the rabbit was secured, he wiped his hands clean on a bandana and reached for his rifle. The weight of the Winchester felt reassuring in his hands, though he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was watching him wouldn't be deterred by a .30-06 bullet. The thought surprised him. He'd never encountered anything in these mountains that proper shot placement couldn't handle, but something about this situation felt fundamentally different from his previous encounters with mountain predators. He shouldered his day pack and began moving toward his camp, following a game trail that wound between granite outcroppings and stands of pine. The trail was familiar, one he'd used dozens of times over the years, but today it felt different, exposed. He found himself glancing frequently over his shoulder and pausing to listen at irregular intervals. The silence followed him. Whatever was out there kept pace with his movement, maintaining a consistent distance he couldn't determine. Occasionally, he caught the whisper of something large moving through the forest parallel to his route, but every time he stopped to investigate, the sounds ceased. It was like being shadowed by an echo that vanished the moment he acknowledged it. His camp sat in a natural clearing where lightning had brought down several large pines decades ago. The fallen giants had created a rough circle of open space surrounded by standing timber, with his tent pitched near the center where he could see approaches from any direction. A fire ring built from local stones held the cold ashes of last night's fire, and his gear was neatly arranged on a tarp spread beneath a canvas lean-to. Caleb approached his camp differently than usual, moving to the edge of the clearing and spending several minutes observing before entering the open space. Nothing appeared disturbed, but the silence that had followed him from the hunting site seemed to intensify here, as if the clearing itself was holding its breath. He kindled a fire using techniques his grandfather had taught him, building it slowly from tinder to kindling to fuel wood until yellow flames danced in the growing twilight. The familiar ritual helped calm his nerves, and the snap and crackle of burning wood provided welcome relief from the oppressive quiet. As darkness gathered in the forest around him, the fire became an island of light and warmth that pushed back against whatever waited in the shadows beyond. But even as he prepared his evening meal, seasoning the rabbit meat with salt and wild herbs he'd gathered earlier, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes, His eyes were drawn to the darkness beyond his fire's reach, searching for movement that never quite materialized. The back of his neck prickled with the constant sensation of unseen observation. He ate quickly, barely tasting the tender meat that should have been a satisfying end to a successful hunt. The fire cast shifting shadows on the surrounding trees, creating an ever-changing landscape of light and darkness that made sustained observation impossible. Every swaying branch became a potential threat, every shifting shadow a possible stalker. When he finished eating, Caleb added more wood to the fire and settled back against his pack to consider his options. The rational part of his mind insisted he was overreacting to what was probably just a curious black bear, or perhaps a mountain lion drawn by the scent of fresh blood. Both species were common in these mountains, and both were known to follow hunters hoping for scraps or an easy meal. But 37 years of hunting experience whispered something different. Bears and cats were careful around humans, but they weren't ghosts. They left tracks, broke branches, disturbed vegetation. Whatever was out there moved through the forest like smoke, leaving no trace of its passage except the profound silence that marked its presence. As the fire settled into a bed of glowing coals, Caleb made his decision. He would stay awake through the night, keeping the fire burning and his rifle close. In the morning, he would break camp and return to his truck. This hunt was over, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. Some instincts were too deep for words, carved into human consciousness during a million years of being prey to things that hunted in the darkness. The first hour passed quietly. Caleb fed the fire regularly and listened to the normal sounds of the mountain night slowly returning. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Bats flittered overhead, their squeaks barely audible as they hunted insects drawn by his fire. The night was cold but clear, with stars brilliant in the thin atmosphere overhead. Then he heard the footsteps. They came from the darkness beyond the fire's reach, heavy and deliberate, moving in a wide circle around his camp. Not the quick, nervous steps of a deer or the padding gait of a mountain cat, but something that walked upright with a measured, purposeful stride. The steps were too slow and too heavy to be human, but they followed a pattern that no four-legged animal would use. Caleb's rifle was in his hands before he consciously decided to reach for it. He thumbed off the safety and tried to track the sounds as they moved around his perimeter, but the darkness beyond his fire made visual contact impossible. The footsteps were clearly audible, crunching through fallen leaves and occasionally snapping twigs with their weight, but they stayed just outside the range of his firelight. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. The footsteps stopped. For 30 seconds, the only sounds were the crackle of his fire and his own rapid heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then the steps resumed, but now they were coming closer, no longer maintaining a respectful distance from his camp. Whatever was out there had decided his challenge merited a response. Caleb stood slowly, keeping the rifle ready and trying to peer into the darkness. The fire had destroyed his night vision, leaving him effectively blind beyond a 20-foot radius. But he could still hear the approaching steps, and they were definitely getting closer. "I'm armed," he called out, though he immediately felt foolish for talking to what was probably an animal. "Stay back." Again the steps paused, and in the silence that followed, Caleb caught a new sound that made his blood run cold. It was breathing, deep and measured, the sound of something large drawing air into equally large lungs. But it was coming from too high off the ground to be any animal he knew, and it had a quality he'd never heard before, intelligent and somehow considering, as if whatever was out there was making decisions about what to do next. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated a wider circle of forest. In that moment of enhanced visibility, Caleb saw something that shouldn't have been there. A shape stood among the trees at the edge of his vision, tall and dark and wrong in ways his mind struggled to process. It was there for only a fraction of a second before the sparks died and darkness reclaimed the forest. But the image burned itself into his memory with perfect clarity. Too tall to be human, too broad to be a bear standing on its hind legs, and shaped like something that existed in the space between nightmares and reality. His rifle was aimed toward the spot before he realized he'd moved it, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. But there was nothing to shoot at now except shadows and uncertainty. Had he actually seen something, or had his frightened imagination conjured a monster from the interplay of firelight and darkness? The breathing sound came again, closer now and definitely from the same direction where he'd glimpsed the impossible shape. It was accompanied by a new smell that cut through the familiar sense of wood smoke and pine. Musk and wetness, and something wild that reminded him of the smell inside a cave where animals had sheltered for generations. It was the smell of something that belonged to the deep wilderness, untouched by human contact. Caleb's mouth went dry. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to run for his truck and get off this mountain as fast as possible. But his grandfather had taught him that running from predators often triggered pursuit reflexes, turning a curious encounter into a deadly chase. Better to stand firm, appear large and threatening, and hope whatever was out there decided he wasn't worth the trouble. The advice felt inadequate against whatever was circling his camp. He added more wood to the fire, building it higher and brighter, pushing the circle of light further into the surrounding darkness. The flames roared up hungrily, sending shadows dancing wildly across the tree trunks. But instead of revealing his stalker, the increased light only seemed to emphasize how much forest remained hidden beyond its reach. "I don't want any trouble," he said aloud, feeling slightly ridiculous for talking to the darkness, but needing to do something with the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Just move along and leave me be." The response was immediate and terrifying. A sound erupted from the darkness that was part roar, part scream, and entirely unlike anything Caleb had ever heard. It was huge and primal and filled with an alien intelligence that made his knees weak. The sound echoed off the surrounding mountains, seeming to come from everywhere at once before finally fading into a silence more profound than anything that had come before. Every small creature for miles around had just received an unmistakable message. Something apex was hunting tonight, and anything with sense would find somewhere else to be. Caleb's hands shook as he gripped his rifle. The sound had been a declaration and a challenge, but it was also something else. A demonstration of power from something that didn't consider him a threat so much as an irritation. Whatever was out there wasn't afraid of him or his weapons. It was simply deciding what to do about his presence in what it obviously considered its territory. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Caleb kept the fire burning bright and tried to watch in all directions at once, but the strain was enormous. His eyes ached from staring into the darkness, and his shoulders cramped from holding the rifle in a ready position. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed amplified and threatening. Then something sailed out of the darkness and crashed into the rocks beside his fire. Caleb spun toward the impact, rifle raised, as a stone the size of a softball clattered among the granite boulders that ringed his camp. The rock had been thrown with considerable force, hitting hard enough to chip fragments from the boulder where it struck. But thrown from where? He'd heard no approach, seen no movement, detected no preparation for the assault. Another stone followed seconds later, this one larger and thrown with even more force. It crashed into a pine tree behind him with enough impact to shower him with bark fragments. The message was clear. Whatever was out there had both the strength and accuracy to hurt him badly if it chose to do so. These were warning shots. "Jesus," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. He'd read about this behavior in accounts of Sasquatch encounters that he'd always dismissed as fantasy or fraud. Rock throwing was supposedly one of the creature's signature behaviors, a way of intimidating threats without directly engaging them. But reading about it in a magazine and experiencing it personally were entirely different things. The stones hitting around his camp weren't being thrown by any animal he knew, and the accuracy required to place them precisely where they'd cause alarm without actual harm suggested an intelligence he wasn't prepared to confront. More rocks followed in quick succession, creating a barrage that had him ducking and scrambling for better cover behind a fallen log. They came from different directions, suggesting either multiple attackers or a single one moving faster than should have been possible. Each impact was precisely calculated, close enough to terrify, not close enough to injure. Yet, when the bombardment stopped, Caleb found himself crouched behind the log with his rifle clutched against his chest, breathing hard and fighting the urge to simply run, screaming into the darkness. The fire continued to burn brightly, but now it felt more like a beacon marking his location than a source of protection. Whatever was out there obviously had no trouble seeing him despite the darkness, while he remained effectively blind beyond his small circle of light. The silence returned, but it was different now. Before, it had been the absence of sound. Now it felt like held breath, like the moment before a storm breaks. Something was coming, and all he could do was wait for it to arrive. He didn't have to wait long. The first indication was a change in the air pressure, as if something very large was displacing the atmosphere around his camp. Then came the smell, stronger now and unmistakably organic, wet fur and musk and something wild that made his hindbrain scream warnings older than civilization. Finally, just at the edge of his firelight, he saw movement. It was huge, much larger than the glimpse he'd caught earlier, and moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so massive. The shape resolved into shoulders broader than a refrigerator, arms that hung almost to the ground, and a head that was wrong in every way that mattered. Too large, too intelligent, too purposeful in its attention to him. The creature stood at the very edge of his firelight, and for several heartbeats, man and monster regarded each other across a distance that suddenly seemed far too small. Caleb's rifle came up automatically, training on center mass, but his finger hesitated on the trigger. The creature wasn't attacking, wasn't even threatening. It was just standing there, studying him with an intelligence that was clearly not animal, but equally clearly not human. Its eyes caught the firelight and reflected it back with an amber glow that reminded him of headlights seen through fog. "My God," he breathed. The creature tilted its head at the sound of his voice, and the gesture was so eerily human that Caleb's worldview shifted fundamentally in that instant. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either, but it was definitely something that thought and reasoned and made decisions based on those thoughts. The rock throwing hadn't been instinctive behavior. It had been a calculated attempt at communication from something that understood cause and effect. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they simply looked at each other. Caleb had the absurd feeling that he was being evaluated, judged by criteria he couldn't begin to understand. The creature's massive chest rose and fell with its breathing, and he could see the intelligence in its eyes as it considered what to do about his presence. Then it stepped forward into the full light of his fire, and Caleb's nerve finally broke. He squeezed the trigger without conscious thought, and the rifle's report shattered the mountain silence like thunder. The bullet took the creature high in the chest, a hit that should have dropped any animal on the mountain. Instead, the impact merely staggered it slightly, and its expression changed from curiosity to something much more dangerous. It roared again, but this time the sound was clearly anger rather than challenge. Caleb was already working the bolt action, chambering another round, when the creature charged. Nothing that large should have been able to move so fast. It covered the 20 feet between them in 2 enormous strides, reaching him before he could bring the rifle to bear again. A massive hand swatted the weapon aside like a toy, sending it spinning into the darkness beyond the fire. Another hand, if that's what those huge, articulated appendages could be called, caught him across the chest and sent him flying backward to crash into his tent with enough force to collapse the entire structure. Caleb rolled frantically to his left as something that might have been a foot slammed into the ground where he'd been lying. The impact dented the earth and crushed his sleeping bag flat. He scrambled on hands and knees toward where his rifle had fallen, but the creature was between him and the weapon, its massive form silhouetted against his fire like something from a fever dream. His hand found the grip of his grandfather's Colt, and he drew it without conscious thought. The .45 bucked in his hand as he fired all 7 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger, aiming for center mass and praying that pistol bullets would succeed where his rifle had failed. Several shots clearly hit. He saw the creature flinch and heard the wet slap of lead hitting flesh, but it didn't slow down. If anything, the gunfire seemed to enrage it further. It lunged forward with another roar that was definitely pain-fueled now, one massive arm sweeping toward him in an arc that would have taken his head off if he hadn't thrown himself backward. Caleb hit the ground hard and rolled again, this time toward the fire. His hand closed on a burning branch and he swung it like a club at the creature's legs. The improvised weapon connected with a shower of sparks, and for the first time, the creature actually stepped back. The flames seemed to command its respect in a way that bullets hadn't. He grabbed another burning branch and scrambled to his feet, wielding fire in both hands like primitive torches. The creature circled him warily now, keeping its distance from the flames, but clearly not retreating. Its eyes never left his face, and he could see intelligence calculating behind them. It was learning from this encounter, adapting its tactics based on what was working and what wasn't. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Caleb's makeshift torches were burning down rapidly, and he knew he had only minutes before they became useless. The creature seemed to understand this too, because it was clearly waiting, patient as only a predator could be. When the first torch burned down to his fingers, Caleb was forced to drop it. The creature immediately pressed its advantage, feinting toward his left side. When he swung the remaining torch to counter the movement, it reversed direction with shocking speed and caught him across the shoulder with a blow that lifted him off his feet. He hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs, and the second torch went flying. The creature was on him before he could recover, one massive hand pinning him to the ground while the other drew back for what would clearly be a killing blow. This close, Caleb could see details that his mind struggled to process. The creature's face was a nightmarish blend of human and ape, with features that belonged to neither species. Its teeth were enormous, designed for tearing rather than chewing. Its breath was hot against his face and smelled of things that had died and rotted in dark places. But it was the eyes that truly terrified him. They held an intelligence that was definitely not human, but just as definitely not animal. This thing could think, could plan, could make decisions based on complex reasoning, and right now it was deciding whether he deserved to live or die. The killing blow never came. Instead, the creature studied his face for several seconds that felt like years, then made a sound that might have been satisfaction or dismissal. The pressure on his chest disappeared as the massive hand lifted away and the creature took several steps backward. It continued to watch him, but the immediate threat seemed to have passed. Caleb lay motionless, afraid that any movement might provoke another attack. His shoulder throbbed where the creature had struck him, and he could feel blood soaking through his shirt from what felt like claw marks. But he was alive, which seemed miraculous given what had just happened. The creature made another sound, softer this time, almost conversational. Then it turned and walked back toward the tree line with that fluid, impossible grace. At the edge of the firelight, it paused and looked back at him one final time. The message was clear. This was its territory, and he was being allowed to leave. Once. Then it melted into the darkness as silently as it had appeared, leaving Caleb alone with his terror and the wreckage of his camp. He lay still for several minutes, listening for any indication that the creature might return. But the normal sounds of the mountain night were gradually reasserting themselves: the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Whatever had just happened was over, at least for now. When he finally managed to sit up, Caleb took inventory of his situation. His rifle was somewhere in the darkness, possibly damaged beyond use. His pistol was empty, and his spare ammunition was buried somewhere in the collapsed tent. His shoulder felt like it might be dislocated, and his entire body ached from being thrown around like a rag doll, but he was alive. It took him over an hour to gather his scattered gear and pack it into his truck by the light of a flashlight with a dying battery. Every shadow made him flinch. Every sound made him reach for weapons he no longer had. But the creature didn't return, and gradually he began to believe that it really had decided to let him go. The drive down the mountain was harrowing, taken on logging roads never meant for night travel, and certainly not by someone with a potentially dislocated shoulder and hands that shook so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. But the truck's engine turned over when he needed it to, and the fuel gauge showed enough gas to reach civilization. He didn't stop driving until he reached the Española hospital, where he told the emergency room doctor that he'd been attacked by a bear. The story was met with skepticism. Bear attacks were rare in October, and his wounds didn't match typical bear behavior patterns. But the alternative explanation was so impossible that even Caleb found himself doubting what had happened as the immediate terror faded. The doctor cleaned and stitched the claw marks on his shoulder and confirmed that it was dislocated, but not seriously damaged. X-rays showed no broken bones, though he had bruises that would take weeks to heal. The attending physician wanted to keep him overnight for observation, but Caleb refused. He needed to go home, needed the comfort of familiar surroundings and his wife's presence. Sarah took one look at him when he walked through their front door and knew something fundamental had changed. He was pale and shaky, jumping at every unexpected sound. When she tried to clean the blood from his clothes, he flinched away from her touch. It took 2 days before he could tell her what had really happened on the mountain, and even then, he wasn't sure she believed him. The story eventually found its way to Jake Begay, who wrote for the Navajo Times and had been documenting traditional stories for 30 years. Jake interviewed Caleb extensively, recording hours of testimony that he compared against similar accounts from across the Southwest. The resulting article was published 3 months later under the headline, "Modern Encounter with Ancient Presence." The article quoted Dr. Sarah Yellowbird, a professor of anthropology at the University of New Mexico, who had studied similar accounts. These encounters follow consistent patterns across multiple cultures and geographic regions. Whether you believe in the literal existence of such creatures or interpret them as psychological manifestations of humanity's relationship with wilderness, the experiences described are clearly profound and transformative for those who live them. Caleb read the article once and never spoke about his encounter again, at least not to outsiders. But he never returned to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and on quiet nights when the wind was right, Sarah sometimes found him standing at their bedroom window, staring out at the darkness as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. The official investigation, such as it was, concluded within a week. A Forest Service ranger hiked up to Caleb's former campsite and found evidence of what might have been a bear encounter. Disturbed vegetation, scattered camping gear, and what looked like large prints in the soft earth near the creek. The prints were photographed, but later dismissed as too unclear to provide definitive identification. "Bears do weird things sometimes," Ranger Martinez told the local newspaper. "They're curious animals, and they're not afraid of humans like they used to be." Mr. Whitehorse probably just had an unfortunate encounter with one that was more aggressive than usual. The photographs of the prints were filed away and forgotten. The case was closed. But Caleb knew what he'd seen, and no amount of official skepticism could change that. He'd looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, and seen an intelligence that was alien but undeniably real. The creature had demonstrated not just physical power, but restraint, choosing not to kill him when it clearly could have done so easily. In the months that followed, Caleb found himself researching similar encounters online, reading accounts from across North America that described experiences remarkably similar to his own. The details varied, but the core elements remained consistent. Massive bipedal creatures, demonstrations of intelligence, rock throwing, and often a sense that the creatures were more curious about humans than actively hostile. He never found a satisfactory explanation for what he'd encountered, but he did find a community of people who'd had similar experiences. Most were reluctant to discuss their encounters publicly, having learned that skepticism and ridicule were the most common responses. But in private forums and quiet conversations, a picture emerged of something that lived in the deep wilderness, avoiding human contact, but occasionally crossing paths with those who ventured too far into its domain. The physical evidence from Caleb's encounter was negligible. His camping gear bore signs of the struggle, but nothing that couldn't be explained by a bear attack. The bullets he'd fired were never recovered, and the creature's tracks had been obscured by wind and weather by the time investigators reached the site. Like most such encounters, it left behind only the testimony of the witness and questions that had no satisfactory answers. Caleb's life settled into a new routine, but the encounter had changed him in ways that became apparent only gradually. He found himself more aware of his surroundings, quicker to notice when the forest sounds changed or when something felt wrong about a situation. He developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when he was being watched, though it was a skill he'd never needed in his previous life. Sarah noticed the changes too. Her husband had always been confident in the wilderness, comfortable in places where others felt vulnerable. Now he seemed constantly alert, always listening for sounds that didn't belong. He installed motion sensor lights around their property and began keeping a loaded shotgun beside their bed. When she asked about these precautions, he simply said they made him feel safer. The nightmares came irregularly, but persistently. Usually they involved being hunted through dark forests by something massive and intelligent, something that could think and plan and anticipate his moves. He would wake gasping and soaked in sweat, his heart racing as if he'd been running for his life. Sarah learned not to wake him during these episodes, having discovered that sudden contact while he was trapped in the dreams sometimes triggered a violent startle response. Gradually, Caleb developed coping strategies. He took up meditation, finding that the breathing exercises helped calm his hypervigilant nervous system. He started running again, something he hadn't done since high school, discovering that physical exhaustion was sometimes the only thing that let him sleep peacefully. He began reading voraciously about animal behavior and wilderness survival, as if knowledge could somehow protect him from experiences that lay outside conventional understanding. The anniversary of the encounter passed without incident, but Caleb found himself thinking about it constantly as October approached. Part of him wondered if he should return to the mountain, if only to prove to himself that he could. But the larger part of him knew he'd never set foot in those mountains again. Whatever was up there had made its message clear. Some boundaries were not meant to be crossed. Winter came early that year, with heavy snows closing the high country roads by mid-November. Caleb found himself grateful for the enforced separation, knowing that whatever lived in those mountains would be dealing with its own challenges during the harsh months ahead. But when spring arrived and the snows melted, He felt the old tension returning, the constant awareness that something was still out there. The second summer after the encounter, reports began surfacing of unusual activity in the Sangre de Cristo range. Hikers reported finding large tracks near mountain streams. Campers described being awakened by strange vocalizations that echoed off canyon walls. A wildlife photographer claimed to have captured blurry images of something large moving through distant timber, though the photos were too unclear to provide definitive identification. Forest Service personnel dismissed most of these reports as misidentification of known wildlife, hoaxes, or the product of overactive imaginations. But Caleb read each account carefully, looking for details that matched his own experience. The patterns were there for those who knew how to look. Descriptions of intelligence in the creature's behavior, accounts of rock throwing, and always the profound silence that preceded encounters. He began corresponding with other witnesses through online forums dedicated to documenting such experiences. Most used pseudonyms and avoided specific details that might identify their locations, having learned that public disclosure often brought unwanted attention from both believers and skeptics. But in private communications, a picture emerged of something that was far more widespread than official sources acknowledged. Dr. Patricia Webb, a wildlife biologist who had spent years researching unexplained primate encounters, contacted Caleb after reading Jake Begay's article. She was working on a comprehensive database of such encounters across North America, applying scientific methodology to reports that were usually dismissed without investigation. The skeptical response to these encounters is understandable, Doctor, Webb explained during their phone conversation. The idea of an unknown primate species surviving in North American wilderness challenges everything we think we know about biodiversity and ecosystem management. But the consistency of witness accounts across vast geographic areas and multiple decades suggests something more than mass delusion or fraud. She was particularly interested in the details of Caleb's encounter that suggested high intelligence in the creature's behavior. "The rock throwing you described isn't random aggression," she told him. "It's a sophisticated form of communication that demonstrates planning, tool use, and understanding of cause and effect. If these creatures exist, they represent a level of cognitive development that we don't see in any known North American wildlife." Caleb found these conversations both comforting and disturbing. It was reassuring to speak with someone who took his experience seriously and could place it in a larger context of similar encounters. But it was also deeply unsettling to realize that his personal nightmare might be part of a much larger phenomenon that official science was either unable or unwilling to acknowledge. As the years passed, Caleb settled into his new reality. He continued to hunt, but only in familiar areas close to home where he felt he understood the rules. He never again ventured into the deep wilderness alone, and he always carried more firepower than was strictly necessary for the game he was pursuing. Friends and family attributed these changes to the bear attack, and he never corrected their assumptions. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind carried the scent of pine down from the mountains, Caleb found himself thinking about the creature he'd encountered. He wondered if it was still up there, still watching the boundaries between its world and human civilization. He wondered if it remembered their encounter as clearly as he did, and whether it understood that he'd never spoken the full truth about what had happened between them. The creature had chosen not to kill him, demonstrating a restraint that suggested complex reasoning about consequences and relationships. It had communicated through actions rather than violence, teaching him that some territories were not meant for human intrusion. Most importantly, it had shown him that the world still contained mysteries that existed beyond the reach of human understanding or control. These were lessons that Caleb carried with him every day, though he'd never found adequate words to express them. The encounter had changed his relationship with wilderness from one of confidence and mastery to something more like respectful wariness. He'd learned that humans weren't necessarily the apex predators they believed themselves to be, and that intelligence came in forms that didn't always conform to human expectations. 5 years after the encounter, Caleb received a phone call from a researcher at the University of Washington who was studying a series of unusual incidents in the Olympic Mountains. The details were remarkably similar to his own experience: a lone hunter, rock throwing, displays of intelligence, and a creature that chose restraint over violence. The witness in this case is a retired Marine, the researcher explained. He's had multiple combat deployments and knows the difference between an animal attack and something more complex. His description of the creature's behavior matches your account in several key details. Caleb listened to the summary of the Olympic Mountains encounter with a mixture of fascination and dread. The idea that similar creatures might exist across multiple mountain ranges was both validating and terrifying. It suggested that his experience hadn't been unique, but it also implied a population of unknown primates living in North American wilderness areas without detection by mainstream science. "What do you think they want?" Caleb asked the researcher. "Based on the consistency of encounter reports, I believe they're trying to maintain boundaries," came the reply. "These creatures seem to understand that humans represent a threat to their survival, but they also seem capable of distinguishing between different types of human intrusion. Hunters, hikers, and researchers are often encountered but rarely harmed. Loggers, miners, and development crews report more aggressive interactions." The conversation left Caleb with new questions about the intelligence he'd encountered. If these creatures could make such sophisticated distinctions about human motivations and activities, what did that suggest about their cognitive abilities? Were they simply highly intelligent animals, or something more complex that didn't fit neatly into conventional categories? He never found satisfactory answers to these questions, but they shaped his thinking about wilderness and humanity's place within it. The encounter had taught him that the natural world still contained elements that existed beyond human understanding or control, and that respect for these mysteries was perhaps more important than solving them. Years later, when reporters occasionally contacted him about similar encounters in the region, Caleb would politely decline to comment. He'd told his story once to Jake Begay, and that had been enough. The encounter belonged to him and the creature that had chosen to spare his life, and some experiences were too profound to share casually with strangers who might reduce them to entertainment or sensationalism. But he never forgot the intelligence in those amber eyes, or the moment when something not quite human had looked at him and decided he deserved to live. It was a gift that came with responsibilities he was still learning to understand, and a reminder that the world still contained wonders that defied easy explanation. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains continued to rise against the New Mexico sky, their peaks snow-covered in winter and purple with distance in summer heat. Somewhere in their remote valleys and hidden canyons, something lived that bridged the gap between animal and something more complex. It watched the boundaries between its world and human civilization, maintaining a balance that most people never knew existed. And in Española, an aging Navajo hunter carried the memory of an encounter that had changed everything he thought he knew about the world and his place in it. He carried it quietly, with the dignity that such experiences deserved, knowing that some truths were too large for words and too important to share with those who weren't ready to receive them. The silence in the pines had taught him everything he needed to know about respect, boundaries, and the persistence of mystery in a world that claimed to have solved all its puzzles. It was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life, and perhaps beyond. In the end, that was enough. The next case. The Kentucky Encounter. Logan Price had been hunting the same ridge in eastern Kentucky for 17 years. Ever since his father first brought him out here as a gangly 15-year-old who could barely draw his compound bow. Now 32, Logan knew these hills like the back of his weathered hands, knew which hollows held the biggest gobblers, and which deer trails led to nothing but frustration and empty tags. The Daniel Boone National Forest stretched for miles in every direction from his usual spot, a maze of ridges and valleys that most people never saw beyond the main trails. This morning felt different, though. Logan couldn't shake the feeling as he picked his way through the pre-dawn darkness toward his favorite turkey blind. The forest seemed too quiet, even for the hour before sunrise. Usually, he'd hear the first tentative chirps of songbirds stirring, the rustle of squirrels beginning their daily routines, maybe the distant hoot of a barred owl finishing its night hunt. Instead, silence pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight. He'd parked his pickup truck at the end of Forest Service Road 192, same as always, and hiked the familiar mile-and-a-half to the ridge overlooking Beaver Creek. The trail wound through thick stands of oak and hickory, with patches of mountain laurel that formed natural corridors between the larger trees. Logan moved with practiced stealth, his camouflaged form ghosting between shadows as he navigated roots and stones he'd memorized long ago. The blind sat 50 yards back from the ridge edge, positioned to give him clear sight lines down into the valley where turkeys like to roost. Logan had built it himself from fallen branches and camouflage netting, reinforcing it each season until it blended seamlessly with the surrounding vegetation. Inside, he'd carved out just enough space for his folding chair and bow, with shooting windows cut at precise angles for maximum coverage. But something was wrong with the blind. Logan stopped 20 feet away, squinting through the gray pre-dawn light. The structure looked intact, but the approach felt different. The ground around it appeared disturbed, though he couldn't make out details in the poor light. He checked his watch. 5:47 a.m. Sunrise wouldn't come for another hour, but he needed to be settled and ready before the first gobble echoed across the valley. Moving closer, Logan knelt and switched on his small LED headlamp, keeping the red filter in place to preserve his night vision. The beam revealed what had triggered his unease. Massive footprints pressed deep into the soft earth around his blind, prints unlike anything he'd seen in nearly 2 decades of hunting these woods. Each footprint measured at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with what appeared to be 5 distinct toe impressions at the front. The depth suggested incredible weight, far more than any black bear Logan had encountered. The prints formed a rough circle around his blind, as if something had walked around the structure multiple times, investigating. Logan's pulse quickened as he followed the track line with his headlamp. The prints led away from the blind toward a game trail that wound deeper into the forest, disappearing into darkness beyond his light's reach. Whatever had made these tracks possessed a stride length that defied explanation. The distance between prints suggested something walking upright on 2 legs, something far larger than any human. A rational part of Logan's mind immediately began searching for logical explanations. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank, though who would hike this far into the wilderness before dawn just to mess with his hunting blind? Maybe the prints belonged to some kind of deformed bear, though he'd never heard of a bear walking exclusively on its hind legs or leaving such clearly defined toe marks. Logan forced himself to focus on the morning's hunt. He'd invested too much time and effort into scouting this location to let some mysterious tracks spook him away. Turkey season only lasted a few weeks, and he'd already burned 2 vacation days to be out here during prime gobbling time. Whatever had visited his blind was gone now, and the tracks looked at least a day old, based on how the edges had dried and crumbled. He settled into the blind and began his morning routine, assembling his compound bow and checking his arrows. The familiar motions helped calm his nerves, muscle memory taking over as he nocked an arrow and adjusted his sight pins. Logan had been bow hunting for 17 years, rifle hunting for 22, and he'd taken dozens of turkeys with both weapons. This morning would be no different, except it was different. As the first grey light of dawn began filtering through the canopy, Logan became increasingly aware of the unnatural silence surrounding him. No birds called, no squirrels chattered. Even the constant background buzz of insects seemed muted, as if the entire forest held its breath. By 6:30 a.m., full daylight revealed the extent of the disturbance around his blind. Not only were there the massive footprints, but several small trees showed damage he hadn't noticed in the darkness. Bark had been stripped away in long gouges, too high and too wide to be made by normal wildlife. One sapling, thick as Logan's wrist, had been snapped cleanly in half about 7 feet off the ground. Logan tried calling turkeys with his slate call, producing the soft yelps and purrs that usually brought immediate responses from roosted birds. Nothing answered. He switched to his diaphragm call, sending sharper cuts and aggressive gobbles echoing down into the valley. Still nothing. In 17 years of hunting this spot, Logan had never experienced complete silence during prime gobbling time. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual this deep in the forest, but it bothered him more than normal, given the strange circumstances. Logan considered hiking back to his truck and trying a different location, but stubbornness kept him in place. He'd driven 2 hours to get here, hiked in before dawn, and carved out the entire day for hunting. Some weird tracks weren't going to run him off. Around 8 a.m., Logan heard the first sound that wasn't made by wind moving through leaves. A low rumble echoed from somewhere deeper in the forest, a sound unlike anything he could identify. It reminded him of a very large dog growling, but deeper and more resonant, as if it came from something with a massive chest cavity. The sound lasted perhaps 5 seconds before fading into silence. Logan gripped his bow tighter and scanned the forest around him, looking for any movement in the shadows between trees. The rumbling sound had seemed to come from the direction the mysterious tracks led, somewhere along the game trail that wound toward the deeper valleys. He waited, barely breathing, but the sound didn't repeat. 20 minutes later, it happened again. The same low rumble, perhaps slightly closer this time, though distances were hard to judge in the thick forest. Logan's rational mind suggested it might be a bear vocalizing, though he'd never heard a bear make quite that sound. More troubling was how the rumble seemed to move between calls, as if whatever made it was traveling along the ridge parallel to his position. By 9 a.m., Logan had decided to pack up and try a different area. The combination of the strange tracks, the unnatural silence, and the mysterious vocalizations had thoroughly spooked him. He'd hunted long enough to trust his instincts, and every instinct screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with this place today. As Logan disassembled his bow and packed his gear, movement caught his eye through the trees below. Something large and dark moved between the trunks about 100 yards down the slope, visible for just a moment before disappearing behind a cluster of mountain laurel. Logan froze, his heart rate spiking as he strained to see through the dense vegetation. The movement had been wrong somehow, too fluid and upright for a bear, too large and purposeful for a deer. Logan waited for several minutes, scanning the area where he'd seen the shape, but nothing else moved. He began to doubt his own eyes. Maybe it had been a shadow or a trick of light filtering through the canopy. Then he smelled it. The odor hit him like a physical blow, a stench so foul and overpowering that Logan instinctively covered his nose and mouth. It smelled like a combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something musky and wild that he couldn't identify. The smell was strong enough to make his eyes water, and it seemed to be getting stronger. Logan grabbed his bow and nocked an arrow, his hands moving with automatic precision despite his racing pulse. Whatever was producing that smell was close, much closer than the movement he'd glimpsed down the slope. The odor was so intense, it seemed to have physical weight, pressing against him like humidity. A branch snapped somewhere behind his blind. Logan spun around, bow raised and arrow drawn, but saw nothing except trees and shadows. The snap had been loud and sharp, the sound of something substantial breaking under considerable weight. He backed against the rear wall of his blind, trying to watch all directions at once, while fighting the urge to gag from the overwhelming stench. Another branch broke, this time to his left, then another to his right. Whatever was out there was moving around him, staying just beyond the edge of his vision, while making no apparent effort to move quietly. The sounds suggested something large and heavy, something that broke through underbrush rather than navigating around it. Logan's mouth had gone completely dry. His hands trembled slightly as he maintained his draw, the bow's 60-pound pull becoming increasingly difficult to hold. He'd been in tight spots before, had surprised black bears at close range, and once stumbled onto a protective doe with fawns. But this felt different. This felt like being hunted. The sounds stopped. The stench remained but seemed to stabilize, no longer growing stronger. Logan waited in the silence, his muscles beginning to cramp from holding the bow at full draw. He couldn't maintain this position much longer, but he was terrified of relaxing his guard even for a moment. A rock struck the tree 6 inches from his head. The impact was sharp and loud, sending bark fragments flying past his face. Logan jerked backward, nearly losing his balance as he tried to locate the source of the throw. The rock had been thrown with considerable force, embedded deep enough in the oak's bark that he could see only a small portion of its grey surface. Another rock whistled past his left shoulder, this one missing by mere inches. Then another, striking the ground at his feet with enough force to send dirt spattering against his legs. The rocks were being thrown from different directions, as if multiple attackers surrounded him, though Logan couldn't see anyone in the dense forest. Panic began to override Logan's hunting experience. He'd heard stories from other hunters about bears throwing objects when agitated, but this felt too coordinated, too purposeful. The throws were accurate and seemed designed to intimidate rather than injure, which suggested an intelligence that made Logan's skin crawl. He made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of standing his ground or trying to identify his attackers, Logan abandoned his blind and ran. He crashed through the underbrush with no attempt at stealth, his only goal to reach his truck and get the hell away from whatever was playing games with him in the forest. Behind him, something roared. The sound was unlike anything Logan had ever heard, a vocalization that seemed to combine the volume of an elk's bugle with the aggressive tone of an angry bear. It echoed off the ridge walls and seemed to come from directly above him, as if something massive stood on the high ground he'd just abandoned. Logan ran harder, his heavy boots slipping on loose leaves and his bow catching on branches that seemed to reach out and grab at him. He could hear pursuit now, the sound of something large crashing through the forest behind him. Whatever chased him made no effort to move quietly, breaking through obstacles with brute force, rather than trying to navigate around them. The game trail Logan followed wound downhill toward Beaver Creek. But he'd have to cross the valley and climb the opposite ridge to reach the parking area where he'd left his truck. It was at least a mile of rough terrain, and he was already breathing hard from the initial sprint away from his blind. A tree fell somewhere behind him, the sharp crack of breaking wood followed by the thunderous crash of branches hitting the ground. Logan risked a glance over his shoulder, but saw only dense forest. Whatever pursued him was still invisible, hidden by the thick canopy and underbrush. But the sounds of destruction suggested something with enormous strength. Logan reached Beaver Creek and splashed across without slowing, his boots filling with icy water as he stumbled over moss-covered rocks. The creek was only knee-deep at this crossing, but the current was strong enough to make him fight for balance. On the far side, he had to climb a steep bank, grabbing at roots and rocks to pull himself up while trying not to drop his bow. The sounds of pursuit had stopped. Logan paused at the top of the creek bank, gasping for breath and listening intently. The forest had returned to its earlier unnatural silence. No birds calling, no insects buzzing. Even the creek seemed to flow more quietly than normal. He waited for several minutes, but heard nothing to suggest he was still being followed. The rational part of Logan's mind began reasserting itself. Maybe he'd overreacted to what was probably just a territorial black bear. Bears could be aggressive during certain times of year, and he might have unknowingly gotten between a sow and her cubs. The rock throwing could have been debris falling from tree damage, and the roar might have been an elk or even another hunter making noise to scare wildlife. But the smell lingered in his memory, that overwhelming stench unlike anything he'd encountered in 20 years of hunting. And the footprints around his blind had been far too large and too human-like to belong to any bear he'd ever seen. Logan decided to circle around to a different trail that would take him back to his truck without passing near his blind. He'd had enough excitement for one morning, and turkey hunting had lost all appeal. All he wanted now was to get back to civilization and maybe grab breakfast at the diner in Pine Knot, while he tried to make sense of what had happened. The alternate trail wound along the ridge face, following contours that kept him at roughly the same elevation as he worked his way back toward the parking area. It was a longer route, but felt safer somehow, keeping him away from the valley floor, where whatever had chased him might still be lurking. Logan had walked perhaps half a mile when he noticed the tracks, more of the same massive footprints he'd found around his blind, but these were fresh. The edges were crisp and well-defined, with no sign of the erosion that comes from rain or wind. Worse, these tracks seemed to parallel his route, staying just off the main trail, but close enough to suggest he was being followed. Logan stopped walking and examined the prints more carefully. Each one pressed deep into the soft earth, deeper than his own boot prints, despite his 180-pound frame. The stride length between prints was enormous, suggesting something with legs much longer than human proportions. Most disturbing were the toe impressions, clearly defined and obviously belonging to something with 5 digits on each foot. He looked up from the tracks and realized the forest around him had changed. The trees seemed taller and more closely spaced, blocking out more of the morning sky. The undergrowth was thicker too, forming a green wall that limited visibility to perhaps 20 feet in any direction. Logan didn't remember this section of trail being so claustrophobic. A branch moved in his peripheral vision. Logan spun toward the movement, bow raised and arrow nocked, but saw only the gentle sway of leaves in a breeze he couldn't feel. The movement had been too deliberate, too localized, as if something large had brushed against the branch while trying to remain hidden. The stench returned, weaker than before but unmistakable. It drifted toward him on what little air movement existed in the thick forest, a rank odor that made his nostrils burn and his stomach clench. Whatever was producing that smell was close, probably within 50 feet, based on the strength of the odor. Logan began walking again, faster this time, no longer trying to move quietly. His priority was reaching his truck, and stealth seemed pointless when whatever stalked him could obviously track his movement regardless. The bow in his hands felt inadequate against something that could snap trees and throw rocks with pinpoint accuracy. The trail began to descend toward another creek crossing, this one smaller than Beaver Creek, but running through a narrow gorge with steep sides. Logan remembered this spot from previous hunts, recalled how the trail switched back down into the gorge and back up the other side. It was a natural choke point, the kind of place where a hunter might wait in ambush for game following the trail, or where something else might wait in ambush for a hunter. Logan slowed as he approached the gorge, every instinct screaming warnings. The narrow confines and limited visibility made this the perfect spot for an ambush, and he had no way to bypass the crossing without adding hours to his hike. His truck was only another half-mile beyond the far side of the gorge. The first switchback took him down into shadows cast by the steep walls. The air felt cooler here, and sounds seemed muffled by the close-pressing stone. Logan could hear water running somewhere below, but the stream remained invisible beyond another switchback. Halfway down the first descent, Logan heard movement above him. Something large was paralleling his route along the rim of the gorge, staying just out of sight but making no effort to move quietly. Rocks, occasionally scattered down the slope, dislodged by whatever moved along the ridge. The sound suggested something walking upright, something with enough weight to send loose stones tumbling with each step. Logan reached the bottom of the gorge and found the stream, a narrow flow of clear water running over smooth stones. The creek was only ankle deep but about 10 feet wide, easy to cross under normal circumstances. But the walls of the gorge rose 30 feet on either side, and the only way out was the trail switchbacking up the far wall. He was trapped. As Logan bent to step into the stream, a massive shape emerged from behind a boulder on the far side of the creek. It stood upright like a man but towered at least 8.5 feet tall, with shoulders broader than any human could possess. Dark brown hair covered its entire body, hanging in thick mats that reached to its knees. The face was ape-like, but with more human proportions than any gorilla Logan had ever seen. And the eyes that stared back at him held an intelligence that made his blood freeze. The creature made no threatening moves, simply stood and watched as Logan slowly straightened from his crouch by the water's edge. Its massive hands hung at its sides, fingers easily a foot long and thick as bratwurst. The feet were enormous, easily matching the prints Logan had been following, with prominent toes that gripped the rocky ground. For perhaps 30 seconds, man and creature stared at each other across the narrow stream. Logan could smell the rank odor more strongly now, a musky animal scent mixed with something fouler that suggested a diet including carrion. The creature's breathing was visible in the cool air of the gorge, and Logan could hear each exhalation as a low rumble in its massive chest. Logan slowly reached for an arrow from his quiver, moving with the careful precision he'd use around a dangerous but unpredictable animal. The creature's eyes tracked his movement, but it made no aggressive response, simply continued watching with what appeared to be curiosity rather than hostility. The arrow knocked easily, and Logan began to draw his bow. The familiar motion felt strange under the creature's intense gaze, and his hands trembled slightly as he pulled the string back to full draw. The broadhead was razor-sharp, designed to take down large game with a single well-placed shot. But before Logan could loose the arrow, the thing's hand swatted him to the ground like he was nothing. The blow came with shocking speed, the creature covering the 10 feet between them in a single bound that sent water spraying in all directions. Logan saw the massive hand coming, but had no time to react before it struck him across the chest with enough force to lift him off his feet and send him crashing into the rocky wall of the gorge. Pain exploded through Logan's ribs as he hit the stone, his bow flying from his hands to clatter somewhere in the stream. He tasted blood and felt the sharp agony that meant at least one rib was broken, possibly several. The impact drove all air from his lungs, leaving him gasping and helpless as he tried to focus his vision. The creature stood over him, close enough that Logan could see individual hairs on its legs and smell the full intensity of its rank odor. It made no move to attack further, simply watched as Logan struggled to breathe and tried to assess his injuries. The eyes that stared down at him held no malice, only a kind of wary curiosity, as if the creature was trying to understand what this small intruder represented. Logan managed to draw a painful breath and tried to speak, though he had no idea what he could possibly say to communicate with such a being. The effort of breathing sent sharp pains through his chest, and he could feel warmth spreading under his shirt that suggested internal bleeding. Instead of speaking, Logan slowly reached into his jacket pocket for his cell phone. The motion brought fresh waves of agony through his damaged ribs, but he managed to retrieve the device and activate the camera. If he was going to die in this god-forsaken gorge, maybe someone would find his body and the photographic evidence. The phone screen showed no signal, as expected, but the camera function worked fine. Logan raised the device with trembling hands and snapped several photos of the creature standing over him. The images appeared on the small screen, but they were blurry and poorly framed due to his shaking hands and the pain that made precise movement impossible. The creature watched this process with apparent interest, its massive head tilting slightly as it observed Logan's use of the strange device. When the camera flash fired for one of the photos, the thing jerked backward with a startled grunt, its eyes reflecting the brief light like an animal's. That reaction gave Logan hope. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't familiar with human technology. The flash had clearly surprised it, suggesting these things avoided contact with people and their devices. Maybe it would retreat now that it had established dominance and investigated the strange intruder. Instead, the creature reached down and plucked the phone from Logan's hands with the gentle precision of someone picking up a soap bubble. Its enormous fingers handled the small device with surprising delicacy, turning it over and examining it from various angles. Logan could only watch helplessly as his only potential link to the outside world disappeared into the creature's investigation. The phone made its normal chirping sound as the creature accidentally triggered some function, and the thing immediately dropped the device into the stream. Logan heard the splash and the distinctive crack of a screen breaking against rocks, and knew his cell phone was now completely useless. The creature looked down at Logan for several more seconds, then made a decision. Instead of leaving him there or finishing what the initial blow had started, it reached down and grasped Logan's jacket with one massive hand. With no apparent effort, it lifted Logan to his feet and steadied him against the gorge wall. Logan expected to be crushed or thrown, but the creature's touch was surprisingly gentle given its enormous strength. It seemed to understand that Logan was injured and made no sudden movements that might worsen his condition. The rank smell was overwhelming at close range, but Logan was too shocked to care about anything except the fact that he was still alive. After ensuring Logan could stand on his own, the creature stepped back and regarded him for another long moment. Then it turned and walked upstream along the narrow gorge floor, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Within moments, it had disappeared around a bend in the stream, leaving Logan alone with his injuries and the wreckage of his cell phone. Logan stood against the rock wall for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Every breath brought fresh pain from his damaged ribs, and he could feel swelling beginning around his left eye where his face had struck the wall. But he was alive, and the creature had actually helped him to his feet rather than finishing him off. Retrieving his bow from the stream proved to be a major effort. The weapon had landed in a deep pool, and Logan had to wade in up to his waist to reach it, the icy water shocking his system and making his injuries feel even worse. The bow seemed undamaged, but his arrows had scattered, and only 2 were recoverable from the rocky streambed. The remains of his cell phone were a total loss. The screen was shattered, and water had invaded the case, leaving the device completely dead. Logan pocketed the ruined phone anyway, knowing he'd need it later to document his story, even if it would never function again. Climbing out of the gorge proved to be the most challenging part of Logan's ordeal. The switchback trail was steep under normal circumstances, but with broken ribs and limited lung capacity, each step became an exercise in endurance. He had to stop frequently to rest and catch his breath, and several times came close to passing out from the pain. By the time Logan reached the rim of the gorge, he was running purely on adrenaline and stubbornness. His vision kept graying at the edges, and he could taste blood with each labored breath. The half-mile to his truck seemed like an impossible distance, but he had no choice except to keep moving or die in the forest. The final stretch of trail felt endless. Logan stumbled frequently, catching himself on trees and rocks as his coordination deteriorated. The pain in his chest had spread to his back and abdomen, suggesting the damage might be more extensive than just broken ribs. He needed medical attention soon, but first he had to reach his truck. When Logan finally saw his pickup through the trees, he nearly collapsed with relief. The familiar red Ford sat exactly where he'd left it, looking like the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He fumbled for his keys with hands that shook from shock and exhaustion, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the driver's door. The truck started immediately, the V8 engine roaring to life with mechanical reliability that seemed miraculous after his encounter with something that shouldn't exist. Logan carefully adjusted the seat and mirrors to accommodate his injuries, then began the long drive back to civilization. The 20-mile drive to Pine Knot took nearly an hour as Logan fought waves of dizziness and nausea. He had to pull over 3 times to rest and regain his composure, and once to vomit blood at the roadside. By the time he reached the small town, Logan knew he needed an ambulance, not just a cup of coffee and a chance to collect his thoughts. The Pine Knot Volunteer Fire Department responded within minutes of Logan's call from the payphone outside Murphy's gas station. The EMTs took one look at his condition and radioed for a helicopter to transport him to the University of Kentucky Medical Center in Lexington. Logan tried to protest that he could drive himself, but lost consciousness before the argument could continue. Logan woke up in a hospital bed with his chest wrapped in bandages and IV lines running into both arms. A doctor explained that he'd suffered 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and significant internal bruising consistent with blunt force trauma. The medical team was amazed he'd managed to walk out of the forest and drive himself to town in such condition. When the police arrived to take Logan's statement, he found himself in an impossible position. How could he explain being attacked by an 8-foot-tall bipedal creature covered in dark hair? The obvious assumption would be that he'd suffered some kind of head injury that caused hallucinations, or that he was covering up a more mundane accident. Logan chose his words carefully, describing his encounter as an attack by a large, unknown animal that knocked him down and fled when he tried to photograph it. He showed them the ruined cell phone and mentioned the strange tracks around his hunting blind, but avoided any specific description of what he'd seen. The investigating officer, a Kentucky State Police trooper named Williams, seemed skeptical of even this limited account. He suggested Logan had probably surprised a black bear, which had knocked him down in its haste to escape. Bears could appear much larger than their actual size when encountered at close range, especially to someone experiencing an adrenaline rush. Logan didn't argue with the bear theory. It was the most logical explanation that didn't involve admitting he'd seen something that science claimed couldn't exist. The official report would list his injuries as the result of a bear encounter while turkey hunting, which was plausible enough to avoid further investigation. Dr. Sarah Chen, the trauma surgeon who treated Logan's injuries, was more perceptive than the police officer. During his 3-day hospital stay, she asked detailed questions about the nature of his wounds and seemed troubled by inconsistencies in the bear attack explanation. "The pattern of bruising across your chest is unusual, Doctor," Chen explained during one of her examinations. "It's consistent with being struck by something with fingers rather than claws. And the force required to break 3 ribs and puncture a lung would suggest an impact from something much larger than the black bears we have in Kentucky." Logan maintained his story, but could see the doctor wasn't convinced. She'd probably seen enough trauma cases to recognize the difference between animal attacks and other forms of injury. But she didn't press the issue, perhaps understanding that her patient had reasons for not revealing the full truth. The hardest part of Logan's recovery was the isolation. He couldn't discuss his experience with family or friends without sounding either crazy or dishonest. His wife, Susan, knew something more had happened than a simple bear encounter, but Logan deflected her questions and attributed his evasiveness to the trauma of being injured. Logan's brother Jake, who'd been hunting with him since childhood, was particularly suspicious of the official story. He knew Logan's experience level and couldn't understand how his brother would have gotten close enough to a bear to be attacked. But Logan stuck to his account, and eventually Jake stopped asking questions. During his recovery, Logan spent hours researching online accounts of similar encounters. He found hundreds of reports from across North America describing creatures matching what he'd seen, though most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. The sheer volume of consistent descriptions from unrelated witnesses made Logan wonder how many other people had experienced something similar but kept quiet to avoid ridicule. 3 weeks after his release from the hospital, Logan drove back to the Daniel Boone National Forest. He didn't go anywhere near his former hunting spot, but he needed to see the area again in daylight and with a clear head. Maybe he'd find some logical explanation for what had happened, some evidence that would make sense of his experience. The Forest Service road looked normal in the afternoon sunshine, just another gravel track winding through Kentucky hills. Logan parked at a different access point and hiked to a ridge overlooking the valley where he'd been hunting. With binoculars, he could see the general area of his blind, though not the structure itself. Everything looked ordinary from this distance. The forest appeared exactly as it should, with no signs of the massive disturbance Logan expected to see if something the size of what had attacked him actually lived in these woods. He began to doubt his own memories, wondering if the trauma and blood loss had caused him to misinterpret a more mundane encounter. Then Logan spotted movement in the valley below. Through his binoculars, he watched a large, dark shape moving between the trees near Beaver Creek. The figure walked upright and seemed too tall to be human, moving with the same fluid grace Logan remembered from his encounter in the gorge. It was too far away to make out details, but the general size and proportions matched his memories perfectly. Logan watched for perhaps 10 minutes as the creature moved along the creek bottom, occasionally stopping to examine something on the ground or in the water. At one point, it looked directly toward Logan's position on the ridge, and even at that distance, he felt a chill of recognition. Those weren't the eyes of any known animal. When the creature finally disappeared into thick forest, Logan packed up his binoculars and returned to his truck. He'd seen enough to confirm that his memories were accurate, that something extraordinary did inhabit these remote valleys. But he also understood that he would never be able to prove what he'd experienced. Logan never returned to turkey hunting. The incident had stolen something essential from his love of the forest, replacing the peace and solitude he'd always found there with a constant awareness of unseen watchers. He sold his bow and most of his hunting equipment, claiming he'd lost interest in the sport after his accident. Susan noticed the change in her husband, but attributed it to normal trauma response after a serious injury. Logan became more cautious about everything, checking locks twice before bed and insisting on carrying a cell phone whenever he left the house. He still enjoyed outdoor activities, but avoided anything that required spending time alone in remote locations. 6 months after his encounter, Logan was contacted by a freelance journalist named David Murphy, who was writing an article about unusual animal encounters in Kentucky. Someone at the hospital had mentioned Logan's case, and Murphy wanted to interview him about his experience with what the medical records described as an unidentified, large animal attack. Logan initially refused the interview, but Murphy was persistent and eventually convinced him to meet for coffee in Pine Knot. The journalist turned out to be a serious researcher rather than a sensationalist, and he documented dozens of similar encounters across the southeastern United States. "The pattern is always the same," Murphy explained over coffee at a local diner. Experienced outdoors people encounter something that doesn't fit any known species. They get hurt or frightened, but the creature doesn't follow through with what should be a fatal attack. Then they clam up because nobody will believe their story. Murphy showed Logan photographs of footprints from various locations, some remarkably similar to what Logan had found around his hunting blind. He also had audio recordings of vocalizations that made Logan's skin crawl with their resemblance to the sounds he'd heard in the forest. "I'm not asking you to go on record," Murphy said. "But if you did encounter something unusual out there, you're not alone, and you're not crazy. There are too many consistent reports from credible witnesses to dismiss all of them as hoaxes or misidentifications." Logan found himself describing his encounter in detail for the first time since it happened. Murphy listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but never expressing skepticism or disbelief. It felt like a tremendous relief to finally tell someone who might understand what he'd experienced. "The thing that gets me," Logan said, "is how intelligent it seemed. This wasn't just some big animal acting on instinct. It made decisions, showed restraint, even seemed curious about my phone. If these things exist, they're smart enough to avoid detection most of the time." Murphy nodded. "That's consistent with other reports. Whatever these creatures are, they seem to understand that contact with humans is dangerous for both species. Most encounters happen by accident. When someone stumbles into territory, the creatures consider their own." "So what are they?" Logan asked. "Some kind of undiscovered primate? A remnant population of something thought to be extinct?" "I don't know," Murphy admitted, "but I think they're real. And I think there are more of them than most people realize. The question is whether they'll remain hidden long enough for science to study them properly, or whether habitat destruction will drive them to extinction before we understand what they are." Logan's story appeared in Murphy's article 6 months later, but only as an anonymous account with all identifying details changed. The article was published in a cryptozoology magazine with limited circulation, ensuring that Logan's identity remained protected while contributing to the growing body of documented encounters. Reading his own experience in print felt surreal, but Logan was glad he'd shared his story with someone who took it seriously. The article included similar accounts from across the region, painting a picture of an elusive species that had learned to coexist with human expansion by avoiding contact whenever possible. 2 years after his encounter, Logan still couldn't walk through dense forest without feeling watched. He'd taken up fishing instead of hunting, preferring open water where he could see in all directions. The experience had fundamentally changed his relationship with the natural world, adding an element of mystery and potential danger that hadn't existed before. Logan often wondered what might have happened if he'd reacted differently during his encounter. What if he'd tried to communicate instead of reaching for a weapon? What if he'd simply backed away instead of attempting to photograph the creature? The questions haunted him because he suspected he'd been granted a glimpse of something remarkable that few humans ever witness. Sometimes, lying awake at night, Logan could still smell that rank odor and feel the gentle but overwhelming strength of the creature's touch as it helped him to his feet. The encounter had lasted only minutes, but it had revealed the existence of something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. Logan never spoke publicly about his experience, but he kept David Murphy's business card in his wallet as a reminder that he wasn't the only person who'd seen something impossible in the Kentucky woods. If he ever encountered the creature again, he'd know who to call, but Logan hoped that day would never come. The official record listed Logan Price of Corbin, Kentucky, as the victim of a black bear attack while turkey hunting in the Daniel Boone National Forest. His injuries were consistent with such an encounter, and the case was closed without further investigation. The broken ribs healed properly, and Logan returned to full activity within 3 months. But Logan knew the truth. And sometimes truth was more terrifying than any lie. On quiet evenings when the wind was still and the forest pressed close around his property, Logan sometimes heard sounds that made him remember that morning in the gorge. Low rumbles echoing from the tree line, the crack of branches breaking under enormous weight, and occasionally a scent carried on the air that made his pulse quicken and his hands shake. Logan would go inside on those nights, lock his doors, and try not to think about what still moved through the shadows beyond his porch light. Some knowledge was too dangerous to possess, too impossible to share, and too real to forget. The creature that had changed Logan's life remained in those Kentucky hills, hidden among ridges and valleys that map-makers had named but never truly explored. It watched the roads and trails, avoided the hunters and hikers, and continued its ancient existence in the spaces between human understanding and wilderness reality. Logan Price had looked into those intelligent eyes and lived to tell the tale, even if he could never tell it completely. In the end, perhaps that was enough. Some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, some creatures were meant to stay hidden, and some encounters were meant to be remembered in silence. The forest kept its secrets, as it always had. Logan simply knew more about those secrets than most people, and that knowledge would stay with him for the rest of his life. Every time he heard that low rumble echoing from distant hills, every time he caught that rank scent on the evening air, Logan would remember the morning when he learned that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. And somewhere in the depths of the Daniel Boone National Forest, something massive and intelligent continued to watch the boundaries between its world and ours, ensuring that encounters like Logan's remained rare enough to be dismissed as impossible by those who preferred their reality neat and well documented. The truth was far messier than that, far more frightening, and far more wonderful than most people could handle. Logan Price knew that truth, carried it with him like a scar that would never fully heal. He'd raised his bow against something that shouldn't exist, felt its power as it swatted him aside like an insect, and lived to remember every impossible detail. That was enough for one lifetime. That was more than enough.